December 11, 1845. The thick, humid air of Aberfoyle, Alabama pressed heavily against the raw timber of rural cabins, marking the entry of Dallas Stoudenmire into a demanding, labor-intensive agrarian existence. Survival in this isolated region required continuous physical exertion from every member of a household. The southern climate provided long, sweltering summers that baked the moisture from the topsoil, followed by brief, damp winters that chilled the uninsulated wooden dwellings. Deep forests of dense pine and tangled briar thickets surrounded the cleared agricultural plots, creating a constant physical barrier against expansion. Those living within Macon County relied entirely on their physical stamina to extract sustenance from the earth and the surrounding wilderness. The geological makeup of the region consisted primarily of compacted red clay, a stubborn material that actively resisted the iron blades of horse-drawn plows. Turning this soil required immense upper body strength and persistent leverage. When saturated by seasonal rains, the clay transformed into a thick, adhesive mire that clung to boots and tools, doubling the physical effort required for standard farming tasks. During dry periods, the ground hardened into a surface resembling fired brick, forcing workers to use heavy iron picks to break the crust before planting seeds. This relentless daily battle against the local terrain built dense, functional muscle on anyone engaged in the agricultural process. Louis Stoudenmire, the patriarch of the family, managed the extensive demands of the property through rigid discipline and unending manual labor. He instructed his children in the strict mechanics of rural survival, delegating tasks that ranged from clearing heavy brush to mending wooden fences shattered by grazing livestock. The family operated without the luxury of modern machinery, relying entirely on forged hand tools. Steel axes, iron hoes, and wooden scythes. Swinging an axe to fell old-growth timber required a specific kinetic transfer of energy, utilizing the hips and shoulders to drive the sharp steel edge deep into the fibrous wood grain. Every swing sent a jarring vibration up the wooden handle into the bones of the arms, building thick calluses on the palms and fingers. Elizabeth Stoudenmire oversaw the equally grueling domestic operations necessary to keep a large frontier family fed and clothed. The preparation of meals involved processing raw, unprocessed ingredients gathered directly from the fields or the hunt. Coarse corn required manual grinding between heavy stones to produce usable meal. Preserving meat without refrigeration necessitated complex salting and smoking procedures, requiring constant monitoring of wood fires to maintain the correct ambient temperature inside the smokehouse. Garments were constructed from rough, durable textiles, sewn by hand using thick needles that frequently pierced the skin of the seamstress, leaving tiny drops of crimson on the fabric. Within this severe environment, young Dallas grew rapidly, his skeletal structure expanding into a massive, imposing frame. By his early teenage years, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, possessing unnaturally broad shoulders and a thick barrel-like chest. His physical proportions dwarfed most fully grown adult men in the surrounding county. Accompanying this immense physical size were pale, unblinking eyes that constantly scanned his surroundings with a cold, analytical focus. He spoke infrequently, choosing instead to observe the harsh realities of frontier life with a silent, detached intensity. This quiet demeanor masked a highly reactive nervous system, finely tuned to detect sudden movements or potential threats in the dense southern brush. Firearms served as essential tools for both acquiring protein and defending the livestock from indigenous predators. Dallas learned the complex mechanics of operating heavy percussion weapons at a young age. These firearms possessed long, octagonal iron barrels that added significant forward weight, requiring strong arm muscles to hold the sight steady on a distant target. He practiced the intricate sequence of loading, measuring the corrosive black powder from a hollowed horn. pouring the volatile grains down the bore, placing a greased fabric patch over the muzzle and forcefully ramming a solid metallic sphere down onto the powder charge using a wooden rod. Firing these large caliber weapons produced a violent physical reaction. Pulling the trigger dropped the heavy iron hammer onto a small copper percussion cap, igniting a microscopic spark that traveled through a narrow channel to detonate the main powder charge. The resulting explosion generated extreme internal pressure, forcing the projectile out of the barrel at high velocity while simultaneously driving the wooden stock backward into the shooter's shoulder with bone-bruising force. Dallas learned to absorb this violent recoil without flinching, keeping his pale eyes fixed open through the thick cloud of white sulfuric smoke to observe the impact of the projectile on the target. Hunting wild hogs in the tangled Alabama undergrowth required absolute nerve and physical resilience. These feral animals possessed thick, tough hides, razor-sharp tusks capable of severing human arteries, and highly aggressive temperaments. Tracking them meant crawling through dense thickets of thorny vines that tore at clothing and lacerated the skin. When cornered, a feral hog would charge with terrifying speed. Dallas learned to wait until the animal closed within a few yards before raising his heavy rifle, ensuring the projectile carried maximum kinetic energy to penetrate the thick skull or shatter the dense shoulder bones of the charging beast. The subsequent butchering of harvested animals removed any lingering youthful sensitivities to blood or internal anatomy. Processing a massive feral hog involved slicing the thick jugular vein to drain the vital fluids into the soil, preventing the meat from spoiling. The carcass then required scalding in vats of boiling water to loosen the coarse bristles before scraping the skin clean with dull iron knives. Dallas routinely plunged his bare hands into steaming abdominal cavities to carefully extract the internal organs, separating the edible liver and heart from the digestive tract. The overpowering odors of raw flesh, copper-tinged blood, and ruptured intestines became entirely normalized sensory inputs. By the spring of 1862, the political fracture of the nation reached the isolated farms of Macon County. The onset of the Civil War triggered a massive mobilization of men across the southern states. Recruitment camps materialized in local towns, filled with fervent speeches and the chaotic assembly of volunteer infantry companies. Dallas, despite being merely 16 years of age, possessed the calloused hands, towering height, and stern facial features of a hardened laborer. He easily bypassed the minimal age verifications of the military authorities and enlisted in the 45th Alabama Infantry Regiment, committing himself to the escalating Continental conflict. The Confederate military apparatus issued basic, inadequate equipment to the new recruits. Dallas received a coarse wool uniform that trapped the searing heat of the southern sun against his skin, causing severe chafing and constant physical discomfort. His footwear consisted of stiff, poorly constructed leather brogans that lacked internal padding, rapidly grinding the skin off his heels during long marches. He was issued a heavy rifled musket, a weapon similar in function to his hunting arms, but equipped with a long, triangular steel bayonet designed specifically for puncturing human torsos during close-quarters combat. The regiment deployed northward, marching toward the active battlefields of Tennessee and Georgia. The journey required covering dozens of miles per day over unpaved, rutted dirt roads that transformed into knee-deep, clinging mud during heavy rainstorms. The men marched in tight columns, breathing in the dense clouds of choking dust kicked up by thousands of boots. Nighttime brought dropping temperatures and minimal shelter. Dallas slept directly on the cold, damp earth, wrapped only in a thin, lice-infested blanket that provided zero insulation against the biting wind. Military camp life introduced a new spectrum of physical suffering entirely separate from combat. The concentration of thousands of men in poorly drained areas without adequate sanitation facilities created ideal breeding grounds for severe bacterial diseases. Dysentery and typhus swept through the encampments, severely dehydrating soldiers and causing violent, continuous bowel evacuations. Men wasted away in soiled tents, their bodies completely drained of fluids. The assigned rations proved equally hazardous. Rock-hard flour, biscuits infested with live weevils, and heavily salted pork that frequently arrived rancid, covered in a thick layer of green mold that had to be scraped off with a pocket knife before consumption. The transition from the misery of camp life to the active front lines exposed the young soldier to unrestrained human butchery on an industrial scale. Approaching his first major engagement, Dallas felt the concussive shockwaves of distant artillery fire vibrating upward through the soles of his boots. The sky above the battlefield filled with screaming high-velocity iron shells that detonated over the dense tree canopies. These explosions sent thousands of jagged iron fragments raining downward at lethal speeds, violently severing the limbs of marching soldiers and ripping open torsos before the men could even register the sound of the blast. The sensory environment of 19th century combat was overwhelmingly violent. Coordinated volleys from thousands of rifled muskets generated a continuous deafening roar that caused physical pain deep within the ear canals. The rapid combustion of immense quantities of black powder produced thick, choking clouds of sulfuric smoke that settled heavily over the fields, reducing visibility to mere feet. Dallas breathed in this toxic air, the sulfur burning the soft tissues of his throat and lungs with every inhalation. He operated his musket mechanically in the blinding fog, tearing the tough paper cartridges with his teeth, pouring the powder and ramming the metallic sphere home while the screams of shattered men echoed through the smoke. During these massive infantry clashes, the sheer mechanical destruction of the human body occurred continuously in his peripheral vision. A man standing shoulder to shoulder with Dallas suffered a direct impact to the face from a heavy incoming projectile, the massive kinetic energy instantly obliterating the jawbone and nasal cavity, spraying warm bone fragments and brain matter across Dallas's wool uniform. Another soldier received a deep abdominal wound, collapsing into the trampled, crimson-soaked grass while desperately attempting to hold his slick, spilling intestines inside his torn stomach cavity with dirt-caked hands. The combat frequently devolved into chaotic close-quarters engagements when opposing infantry lines collided. In these frantic moments, firearms became heavy clubs and the steel bayonet became the primary instrument of survival. Dallas engaged in brutal hand-to-hand violence, utilizing his massive physical strength and height advantage. Plunging a bayonet into an enemy soldier required immense forward momentum to punch through the thick wool uniforms, sever the muscular tissue, and bypass the rigid ribcage. Extracting the blade required an equally forceful backward pull, often necessitating placing a heavy boot onto the fallen man's chest to wrench the blood-slicked steel free from the suction of the collapsing lung cavity. It was during one of these chaotic skirmishes that Dallas sustained a severe traumatic injury. Without warning, an incoming enemy projectile struck his torso with bone-jarring, devastating force. The heavy metallic sphere tore violently through his uniform fabric, rapidly penetrating deep into the dense muscle tissue of his side. The immense transfer of kinetic energy physically lifted his massive frame and knocked him backward into the churned dirt. A searing white-hot pain radiated outward from the jagged, pulsating entry wound as hot arterial fluids began rapidly soaking through his clothing, pooling darkly on the ground beneath him. Fellow infantrymen grabbed his arms and dragged his heavy body behind the shattered remains of a wooden earthwork. A soldier applied crude, forceful downward pressure onto the open wound with unwashed, dirt-stained hands in a desperate attempt to stem the spurting hemorrhage. Dallas remained entirely conscious, his breathing shallow and rapid, his pale eyes tracking, the chaotic violence erupting above his cover. He was eventually hoisted into a jolting, unsprung wooden supply wagon, laid on the hard planks alongside other screaming casualties, and transported over deeply rutted, debris-strewn dirt roads toward the rear lines. The makeshift field hospital consisted of large canvas tents erected in a muddy clearing, reeking offensively of rotting flesh, sweet chloroform, and voided human waste. Exhausted surgeons, their bare forearms completely slick with dried and fresh gore, operated continuously on rows of moaning men laid across bloody wooden tables. The ground outside the primary surgical tent held growing piles of amputated limbs tossed carelessly into the dirt. Dallas was forced down onto a fluid-soaked plank while a surgeon brutally probed his open wound with unwashed, crude steel forceps, searching blindly for the embedded object. The extraction attempt proved entirely unsuccessful. The heavy projectile had traveled deep into his musculature, lodging firmly near vital organs where the blunt surgical instruments could not safely reach. The doctors abandoned the effort, roughly stitching the torn flesh closed with coarse, unsterilized silk thread, leaving the foreign metal permanently embedded inside his body. He was moved to a recovery tent and left on the damp ground. Severe bacterial infection set in hours later, triggering an intense, agonizing fever, violent full-body chills, and days of dark delirium where his mind continuously replayed the deafening artillery blasts. Dallas survived the microscopic onslaught through sheer physical stamina and deep genetic hardiness, eventually breaking the high fever. However, the embedded metal remained permanently lodged inside his tissue, creating a constant source of chronic, sharp physical pain that flared with every sudden movement. This permanent injury fundamentally altered his physical comfort, constantly reminding him of the trauma and further souring his already stoic and cold disposition. After a brief, miserable convalescence on reduced rations, the military command deemed him fit for duty, thrusting him directly back into the relentless meat grinder of the late war campaigns. The Confederate forces now faced catastrophic logistical failures and complete supply chain collapse. Dallas marched for miles over frozen, jagged winter ground entirely barefoot, his boots having rotted away entirely. He wrapped his bleeding feet in torn, filthy rags that left bright red, frozen footprints pressed deeply into the winter snow. Frigid, relentless winds cut sharply through his thin, tattered wool uniform, chilling his internal core temperature dangerously low. The men resorted to huddling together tightly at night simply to prevent freezing to death in the open trenches. Extreme physical hunger became a constant gnawing sensation that consumed his thoughts. Rations disappeared entirely. Desperate soldiers foraged wildly through the discarded, blood-stained haversacks of fallen comrades, searching for stray crumbs, rotting fruit, or any moldy organic matter that could sustain life. Some men boiled their leather belts in stagnant water to chew on the softened hide. This continuous daily exposure to extreme deprivation, constant violence, and the sudden violent loss of thousands of surrounding men fundamentally reshaped Dallas's internal psychology. Natural human empathy eroded away entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating, predator-like survival instinct. He learned to act without the slightest hesitation or moral restraint. Hesitation on the battlefield equated to instant death. He killed opposing soldiers at terribly close range without registering their facial features or hearing their desperate pleas. The act of taking human life became a purely mechanical function, a necessary physical motion performed solely to ensure his own continued respiration. The severe environment stripped away all societal conditioning, leaving only the raw, brutal reality of the apex predator operating within a chaotic, lawless void. By April 1865, the exhausted, starving Confederate military apparatus formally collapsed. The commanding generals signed surrender documents, bringing the grueling multi-year conflict to a definitive halt. The fighting ceased, leaving the southern landscape in total economic ruin, widespread infrastructural devastation, and profound social chaos. 19-year-old Dallas Stoudenmire, heavily scarred by close-quarters combat, harboring jagged metal within his torso, and profoundly traumatized by years of continuous slaughter, began the exceptionally long, slow walk back to his point of origin in Alabama. The slow journey southward revealed a completely devastated geography. The marching armies had stripped the land bare. Dallas walked past burned plantation houses reduced to nothing but blackened brick chimneys pointing at the sky. He crossed destroyed railroad lines, where the heavy iron rails had been heated and violently twisted around massive tree trunks, completely severing transportation routes. The local populations he encountered wandered aimlessly through the ashes, starving, desperate, and devoid of any structured authority or law enforcement. He arrived back at the Aberfoyle homestead to find his family struggling intensely to survive the bleak post-war poverty. The local agricultural economy had completely vanished. The fields lay barren, overgrown with thick weeds. There were zero employment opportunities available, no viable cash crops remaining to sell, and absolutely no future visible in the scorched, stagnant environment of his youth. The jarring transition from the chaotic, high-adrenaline environment of continuous warfare to the stagnant, defeated silence of the ruined farm proved mentally grating and deeply uncomfortable. The eerie quiet of the rural night violently clashed with the extreme hypervigilance drilled permanently into his nervous system. He could not sit with his back to an open window or door. He carried a heavy percussion revolver concealed on his person at all times, a deeply ingrained, unbreakable habit forged in the hostile trenches. The chronic physical pain from his unhealed war wounds flared intensely during periods of high humidity, sharply spiking his temper and making him highly prone to dark, brooding moods and aggressive physical reactions to minor annoyances. Recognizing the total lack of viable opportunity and the suffocating decay surrounding him in Macon County, Dallas turned his focus westward toward Texas. The vast, untamed frontier territory promised massive open land, highly dangerous employment, and a chaotic, unregulated environment where his particular set of lethal, hardened skills held extremely high value. He quietly gathered his few remaining possessions, thoroughly cleaned, oiled, and packed his heavy black powder weapons and departed his childhood home forever. He left the ruined, defeated South behind, stepping toward the rugged, lawless expanses of the western frontier to forge a brutal new existence. 1865. The dense, damp timberlands of the eastern states gradually yielded to the sprawling, sun-scorched expanses of the western territories, as Dallas crossed the muddy waters of the Mississippi River. The slow, groaning ferry ride across the wide current marked a definitive boundary between the ruined agricultural society of his youth and the untamed frontiers of Texas. He carried only a worn canvas bedroll, a tin canteen, and his oiled firearms, stepping onto the western bank with a solitary focus on survival. The air grew noticeably thinner and drier, stripping moisture from his skin and coating his clothing in a permanent layer of fine, pale dust. He joined a chaotic stream of displaced men moving westward, a silent, towering figure walking alongside rattling wooden wagons and exhausted draft animals, his pale eyes scanning the unfamiliar horizon. The sheer geographical scale of Texas presented a daunting obstacle for travelers. The landscape shifted dramatically, from dense piney woods to rolling oak-studded hills, and finally to flat, featureless plains covered in coarse mesquite and sharp prairie grass. The sun beat down with relentless intensity, baking the earth until deep fissures cracked the topsoil. Water sources proved exceptionally scarce, requiring men to rely on stagnant, muddy pools fouled by passing livestock. Dallas navigated this harsh terrain primarily on foot and occasionally by hitching rides on passing freight wagons, his boots grinding against the abrasive dirt and sharp flint rocks. The journey forced him to adapt to a rugged, nomadic existence, sleeping directly under the open sky and eating meager, dry rations. Arriving in the burgeoning frontier settlements of central Texas, he encountered a volatile mixture of desperate ex-soldiers, opportunistic businessmen, and hardened criminals fleeing eastern jurisdictions. These rudimentary towns consisted of hastily constructed timber storefronts, muddy thoroughfares deeply rutted by wagon wheels, and numerous canvas-tented saloons dispensing cheap, intoxicating liquor. The absolute absence of structured law enforcement created a chaotic environment where disputes were routinely settled with edged weapons and firearms right in the middle of the street. Dallas avoided the crowded, loud gambling halls initially, recognizing the lethal chemistry of alcohol and armed men. Instead, he sought employment that utilized his immense strength and high tolerance for prolonged suffering. He secured a demanding position as a teamster, driving large freight wagons loaded with essential supplies across the desolate, hostile stretches between isolated settlements. This grueling occupation required maneuvering stout wooden vehicles pulled by teams of 8 to 12 stubborn mules or thick-necked oxen. The work demanded constant vigilance and sheer muscle power to keep the iron-rimmed wheels from snapping in deep ravines or sinking entirely into muddy river crossings. Dallas stood on the wooden buckboard, his large, calloused hands gripping the thick leather reins, constantly shouting hoarse commands and cracking a long, braided rawhide whip over the backs of the draft animals to maintain a steady, grueling pace under the blistering Texas sun. The freight trails offered zero protection from the numerous threats roaming the remote prairies. Armed bands of outlaws actively targeted these slow-moving supply chains, seeking to intercept valuable cargo such as tools, whiskey, and raw silver. One sweltering afternoon, miles from any established settlement, a group of 4 mounted bandits intercepted his wagon near a shallow, dried creek bed. They rode down the steep dirt banks with weapons drawn, yelling aggressive demands for him to halt the oxen and surrender the cargo. The hot wind carried the metallic clicking of their gun hammers cocking back, signaling an impending attack. Dallas reacted with cold, mechanical efficiency. Instead of pulling back on the reins to stop, he dropped low into the wooden bed of the wagon, using the stout cargo crates for solid cover. He produced his large-caliber sidearm, resting the octagonal barrel against a wooden crate to steady his aim. As the first bandit charged forward on horseback, firing wild shots that splintered the wagon's sideboards, Dallas exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The weapon roared, expelling a dense cloud of white smoke and sending a solid metallic sphere tearing through the bandit's chest cavity. The crushing force shattered the man's sternum, collapsing his lungs and throwing his lifeless body backward off the galloping horse into the sharp mesquite brush. The remaining 3 attackers instinctively reined their horses hard, disoriented by the sudden resistance. Dallas did not pause to assess the fallen man. He swiftly cocked the hammer of his weapon, shifting his focus to the next target. He fired a second round, striking another outlaw's horse in the thick shoulder. Muscle. The animal screamed, collapsing forward and pinning its rider beneath thousands of pounds of thrashing muscle and bone. The final 2 bandits, realizing the severe tactical disadvantage, aggressively spurred their mounts and fled back up the dusty embankment, disappearing into the vast expanse of the prairie. Dallas calmly reloaded his empty cylinders before resuming his methodical journey. By the late 1860s, the booming Texas cattle industry offered a different avenue of dangerous, high-paying labor. Dallas transitioned from driving wagons to working as a drover, pushing vast herds of longhorn cattle hundreds of miles northward toward the Kansas railheads. These beasts possessed wild, unpredictable temperaments and wide, sweeping horns capable of impaling a horse and rider with a single thrust. The demands of the trail proved unyielding. He spent 14 to 16 hours a day in a saddle, his legs bowed around the horse's ribs, inhaling the choking dust kicked up by thousands of cloven hooves marching across the dry earth. The cattle drives exposed him to relentless environmental hazards. Severe thunderstorms frequently swept across the open plains, bringing terrifying displays of jagged lightning that caused the tense longhorns to stampede. During these chaotic events, Dallas rode at a full, reckless gallop through the pitch-black night, relying entirely on his horse's instincts to avoid unseen prairie dog holes and deep ravines. A single misstep meant being crushed to death beneath a relentless wave of panicked livestock. Swollen river crossings required forcing the frightened animals into turbulent, muddy waters, where both cattle and men frequently drowned, their lungs filling with silt as they were dragged under by the powerful currents. Reaching the destination cow towns at the end of a grueling drive introduced a different type of hazard entirely. Months of built-up tension on the isolated trails, combined with sudden influxes of cash, turned these bustling railhead settlements into combustible powder kegs. Saloons operated continuously throughout the night, filled with exhausted, highly agitated drovers consuming large quantities of harsh, poorly distilled whiskey. Disagreements over card games, lingering resentments from the trail, or perceived insults routinely escalated into deadly close-quarters gunfights. Dallas navigated these cramped, dimly lit and smoke-filled rooms with absolute caution, always ensuring his broad back rested firmly against a solid structural wall while keeping his holstered sidearms entirely clear of any wooden chairs or tables. During a crowded evening in a Kansas saloon, an intoxicated drover from a rival outfit initiated a severe altercation. The man shoved a wooden table aside, screaming profanities and drawing a revolver from his holster. The loud piano music abruptly ceased as patrons scrambled frantically toward the exits, knocking over chairs and shattering glass bottles in their desperation to escape the impending crossfire. Dallas remained completely still, his eyes locked onto the aggressive individual. Before the drunk could fully raise his weapon, Dallas's right hand moved with blinding, practiced speed. He drew his own large revolver, cleared the leather holster, leveled the barrel, and fired a single deafening shot across the short distance. The high-velocity projectile struck the aggressor directly in the center of his forehead, penetrating the thick cranium and scrambling the frontal lobe before exiting through the rear of the skull in a spray of dark fluid and bone fragments. The man collapsed instantly, dropping like a severed weight onto the sawdust-covered floorboards, his weapon clattering harmlessly away into the corner. The room plunged into stunned silence, broken only by the ringing echo of the gunshot and the sharp, acidic smell of burnt black powder. Dallas slowly lowered his smoking weapon, his facial expression entirely unchanged, and calmly ordered a drink while the local undertaker was summoned to remove the remains. The sheer frequency of these violent encounters in the frontier settlements solidified his reputation as a deadly, uncompromising individual. As the 1870s commenced, the vast Texas territory faced an escalating crisis of lawlessness. Displaced populations, bloody feuds between rival family factions, and highly mobile bands of livestock thieves created a desperate need for capable enforcement. Recognizing a structured outlet for his specific skill set, Dallas served for a while in January 1874 as a second sergeant in J.R. Waller's Company A of the Texas Rangers, a state-sponsored paramilitary organization tasked with actively hunting down fugitives and suppressing frontier crime across vast, unpoliced counties. Joining this elite outfit meant stepping into a relentless cycle of pursuit and confrontation, serving as the thin line between civilization and total anarchy in the borderlands. Joining the Rangers required men to supply their own horses, saddles, provisions, and weaponry. There were no standardized uniforms. The men wore durable canvas trousers, thick leather boots, and wide-brimmed hats to block the searing sun. Dallas equipped himself with a pair of large-caliber revolvers and a short-barreled lever-action rifle, utilizing the newly developed metallic cartridge technology. These modern firearms eliminated the tedious process of pouring loose powder and seating individual caps. Instead, they utilized self-contained brass casings housing the primer, propellant, and projectile in one waterproof unit, drastically increasing his rate of fire and reloading speed during intense skirmishes. This technological shift provided a distinct tactical advantage when facing outlaws who still relied on antiquated, slow-loading percussion muskets and cap-and-ball sidearms. He modified his new weaponry to maximize efficiency and lethal speed. He carefully filed down the front iron sights of his revolvers to prevent them from snagging on the interior leather of his holsters during a rapid draw. He practiced relentlessly, developing a specialized technique known as slip shooting. This involved securing the trigger backward and manually manipulating the hammer with the heel of his opposite hand, allowing him to discharge all 6 chambers in a fraction of a second with devastating close-range accuracy. His large hands handled the stout steel frames effortlessly, treating the deadly tools as natural extensions of his own arms. The hours spent repeating this singular motion built profound muscle memory, ensuring his reactions remained entirely instinctual whenever a threat presented itself in the unpredictable frontier towns. Ranger operations involved grueling patrols deep into the harsh, unforgiving brush country of southern and western Texas. The terrain consisted of dense thickets of thorny chaparral, sharp agave plants, and jagged, limestone outcroppings that tore at clothing and sliced horseflesh. Water remained the most critical and scarce resource. Dallas and his fellow rangers often rode for days under the brutal sun, their canteens running completely dry, forcing them to chew on pieces of raw leather to generate enough saliva to swallow. They tracked hardened criminals across this desolate landscape, following microscopic disturbances in the dust and broken twigs that indicated human passage. Every snapped branch or displaced pebble served as a crucial clue, narrowing the distance between the lawmen and their desperate quarry hiding within the vast uninhabited stretches of the borderlands. Tracking required a highly focused analytical mindset. Dallas learned to read the arid ground like a detailed map. A crushed blade of dry grass, a slightly overturned stone revealing darker soil beneath, or a faint indentation of a horseshoe in the hardened clay told a specific story of direction, speed, and numbers. He spent countless hours leaning out of his saddle, his eyes scanning the dirt ahead, moving slowly and silently through the heat waves radiating off the desert floor. The psychological strain of the hunt proved immense, knowing that the pursued men were well armed and actively seeking an opportunity to set an ambush. The grueling pace required absolute discipline, as the outlaws often traveled through the night, forcing the rangers to push their exhausted mounts to the absolute limit just to maintain the fresh trail. The rangers also faced the severe threat of highly mobile indigenous raiding parties. Comanche and Apache fighters actively resisted the encroaching settlements, striking isolated farms with terrifying speed to steal valued horses and exact retaliation. These warriors possessed unparalleled equestrian skills, capable of clinging to the side of a galloping horse while firing dense iron-tipped arrows with devastating accuracy. Confronting them required immense tactical discipline and raw courage. Dallas found himself thrust into numerous chaotic skirmishes against these formidable adversaries in the remote, rocky canyons of the Texas frontier. The vast distances between outposts meant any engagement was fought without the possibility of reinforcements, turning every encounter into a desperate, isolated struggle for survival against highly motivated indigenous forces defending their ancestral hunting grounds. During one particularly vicious patrol, his ranger company tracked a large band of raiders into a narrow, steep-walled canyon composed of jagged red sandstone. The intense heat trapped between the rock walls made breathing difficult. Suddenly, the silence shattered as a barrage of high-velocity projectiles and whistling arrows rained down from the high ridges. A large caliber bullet struck the horse riding directly in front of Dallas, instantly dropping the animal and sending its rider crashing violently into the rocky dust. The narrow confines of the canyon amplified the deafening roar of the ambush. Dust and pulverized rock rained down from the cliffs as incoming slugs chipped away at the sandstone, filling the stagnant air with the acrid stench of burnt gunpowder and the frantic screams of wounded livestock. Dallas reacted swiftly, leaping from his saddle and slapping his horse's flank to send it running out of the line of fire. He dove behind a sun-baked boulder, pulling his lever-action rifle from its leather scabbard. He ignored the stone chips raining down on his hat as enemy bullets impacted the rock face merely inches from his head. He quickly assessed the high ridges, his pale eyes searching for the faint puffs of white smoke that betrayed the shooter's positions. Once he acquired a target, he braced the rifle against the boulder, aligned the sights, and squeezed the trigger. The smooth mechanical action of the weapon fed a fresh cartridge into the chamber instantly, allowing him to maintain a steady, calculated rate of return fire against the elevated threats hidden among the jagged crags. The rifle barked, sending a high-velocity cartridge screaming upward. The projectile found its mark, striking a raider positioned on the high cliff edge. The kinetic force lifted the man backward, sending him tumbling down the jagged rock face to crash lifelessly onto the canyon floor. Dallas rapidly worked the lever action, ejecting the spent brass casing and chambering a fresh round, maintaining a steady, calculated rate of suppressive fire. The intense firefight lasted for an agonizing hour, with men bleeding out in the dirt and the constant deafening echo of gunfire bouncing off the canyon walls until the surviving raiders finally retreated. The sheer volume of ammunition expended left the ground littered with gleaming brass casings, while the lingering smoke slowly drifted out of the gorge, revealing the grim toll taken on both sides of the skirmish. The brutal aftermath involved gathering the dead and wounded. The Rangers dug shallow graves in the unyielding rocky soil using their knives and bare hands, covering the bodies with large stones to deter scavenging predators. There were no solemn ceremonies, merely the grim reality of burying fallen comrades before the high temperatures rapidly accelerated decomposition. Dallas cleaned his weapons, reloaded his empty magazines, and remounted a spare horse, his face an unreadable mask of cold stoicism. The constant exposure to this severe, unforgiving violence continued to harden his internal psychology, completely eroding any remaining capacity for normal human sympathy. He viewed the casualties not as tragic losses, but as inevitable consequences of the brutal landscape, compartmentalizing the trauma deep within his psyche as he prepared to ride further into the hostile and unforgiving territory. Following his time in the brush country, Dallas was frequently dispatched to Central Texas towns embroiled in bloody feuds between rival, local factions. Entire counties operated under states of total lawlessness, with armed posses openly murdering political rivals and enforcing vigilante justice. The Rangers functioned as an occupying military force, tasked with breaking the power of these local syndicates. This required riding directly into hostile settlements, confronting large groups of well-armed men in public squares and demanding the unconditional surrender of wanted individuals through sheer intimidation and the threat of overwhelming lethal force. These assignments demanded a delicate balance of aggressive posturing and calculated restraint, as a single misstep or perceived sign of weakness could instantly ignite a massive, chaotic gun battle in the center of a populated community. In one volatile settlement, Dallas dismounted in front of a busy saloon holding a warrant for a prominent member of a local faction. A crowd of the wanted man's supporters quickly gathered on the wooden boardwalk, hostile and gripping the handles of their sidearms. Dallas walked deliberately toward the center of the street, his imposing frame dominating the space. He did not draw his weapons, but his hands rested lightly on the exposed grips of his twin revolvers. He locked eyes with the loudest instigator, speaking in a low, even tone that carried clearly over the rising wind, promising instant retaliation if a single weapon cleared leather. His unblinking stare cut through the bravado of the assembled mob, projecting an aura of absolute confidence and a clear willingness to slaughter every man present if they chose to test his documented resolve. The sheer intensity of his gaze and his well-documented reputation as a remorseless man-killer broke the crowd's resolve. The supporters slowly backed away, their hands moving away from their gun belts. Dallas entered the saloon, located his target, and physically dragged the resisting man out the front doors by his shirt collar, throwing him roughly onto the back of a waiting horse. This method of aggressive, uncompromising law enforcement proved highly effective, but it severely isolated him from the general public. He was viewed not as a protector, but as an exceptionally dangerous, unpredictable force of nature to be deeply feared and actively avoided. Citizens crossed the street to avoid his path, speaking in hushed whispers as he rode past, cementing his status as a solitary enforcer completely detached from the communities he was officially tasked with pacifying. The continuous daily stress of operating in this highly lethal environment exacted a severe toll on his physical and mental state. His skin transformed into a deeply lined, weathered texture from years of constant exposure to the blistering sun and biting wind. The endless hours spent in the saddle compressed his spine and ground down the cartilage in his knees, causing a permanent stiff-legged gait when walking. The deep hypervigilance became permanently hardwired into his nervous system. He slept lightly, awakening fully at the slightest unfamiliar noise, his hand instinctively gripping the loaded revolver he kept beneath his canvas pillow. Even during rare moments of rest in civilized boarding houses, he remained trapped in a perpetual state of combat readiness, unable to power down the survival instincts that kept him alive on the savage frontier. He developed a strict, inflexible set of personal rules to ensure his continued survival. He never sat with his back facing a door or window in any public establishment. He completely avoided heavily crowded spaces where an unseen attacker could approach from a blind angle. He meticulously maintained his firearms, disassembling, cleaning, and oiling the internal mechanisms daily to guarantee absolute reliability. A single mechanical failure during a close-quarters confrontation meant certain death, and Dallas trusted his weapons far more than he trusted any human companion. This paranoid, meticulous routine dictated every aspect of his daily life, transforming him into an isolated, hyper-aware machine operating entirely on logic, self-preservation, and an overriding distrust of anyone crossing his path. By the late 1870s, Dallas decided to leave the structured ranks of the Texas Rangers. The low state pay and the increasing bureaucratic oversight clashed with his fiercely independent, volatile nature. He transitioned into operating as an independent contractor, offering his violent services to desperate municipalities struggling to control severe criminal elements. He possessed a unique, highly marketable resume, an intimidating physical presence, a complete lack of moral hesitation when deploying force, and unparalleled speed and accuracy with primary firearms. This mercenary approach allowed him to command premium wages from wealthy land barons and terrified city councils who needed a ruthless operator to cleanse their territories without the constraints of official judicial procedures. He wandered the frontier, taking on dangerous assignments, tracking down fugitives for high bounties, or working as a specialized enforcer for wealthy cattle barons facing organized rustling rings. These independent operations frequently culminated in sudden, extreme violence. During a pursuit near the Mexican border, he cornered a pair of notorious livestock thieves inside an abandoned adobe structure. Instead of calling for surrender, Dallas forcefully kicked the stout wooden door off its hinges, diving low into the dark room. As the startled thieves reached for their rifles, his twin revolvers roared simultaneously. The deafening blasts illuminated the shadowy interior with twin flashes of orange fire, instantly neutralizing the threat before the cornered men could even shoulder their weapons or process the sudden, violent intrusion into their hideout. The twin projectiles struck their targets with devastating precision, blowing large exit wounds through the backs of the outlaws and painting the adobe walls with crimson fluid. Dallas emerged from the structure coughing through the thick black powder smoke, holstering his hot weapons before securing the stolen property. As 1879 drew to a close, Dallas Stoudenmire stood as a fully formed instrument of destruction. He operated entirely outside standard societal norms, existing as a cold, calculating, and exceptionally dangerous gunman, perfectly conditioned for the unforgiving hostilities waiting for him in the most lawless corners of the expanding western frontier. The brutal experiences of the past decade had stripped away any lingering remnants of his former life, forging him into an uncompromising executioner ready to impose his own brand of merciless order upon the chaotic borderlands. April 8, 1881. The remote settlement of El Paso sat isolated at the extreme western edge of the Texas landmass, pressed firmly against the shallow, muddy current of the Rio Grande. A forbidding ring of barren, jagged peaks known as the Franklin Mountains walled the community off from the northern plains. The surrounding Chihuahuan desert provided nothing but sharp agave, twisted creosote bushes, and a relentless baking heat that dominated the local climate for 9 months of the year. Fine, alkaline sand coated every exposed surface, driven through the thoroughfares by high-velocity wind gusts that stripped moisture from human eyes and throats. This severe geographic trap functioned as a natural catch basin for displaced vagrants, fleeing felons, and opportunistic predators who possessed no intention of crossing the river into foreign jurisdiction. The architectural composition of the border town reflected its stark environment and lack of refined resources. Stout, adobe structures dominated the main avenues, constructed from sun-baked bricks of mud and dried straw. These primitive flat-roofed buildings absorbed the searing daytime temperatures and released the trapped warmth slowly throughout the frigid desert nights. Wooden timber proved exceedingly rare, utilized solely for the structural supports of saloon awnings and the sturdy double doors of the numerous gambling halls. The dirt streets remained deeply rutted by freight wagons, turning into impassable adhesive trenches of thick mire during brief seasonal rainstorms. A profound economic shift was rapidly accelerating the decay of any existing social order within the isolated community. 3 separate transcontinental railroad projects were aggressively laying iron tracks toward the pass, driving a chaotic wave of unregulated expansion. The promise of unprecedented commercial wealth attracted thousands of transient laborers, skilled engineers, and an influx of parasitic criminal enterprises determined to harvest the incoming wages. Tent cities constructed of filthy canvas and scrap lumber erupted haphazardly around the permanent adobe structures, housing a volatile population of strangers crammed into incredibly tight quarters. This sudden population explosion completely overwhelmed the primitive infrastructure. Sanitation simply did not exist. Discarded animal carcasses, raw sewage, and shattered glass littered the narrow alleys between the gambling houses. The overpowering stench of stale beer, equine manure, and unwashed human bodies hung thickly in the stagnant desert air. Disease spread rapidly through the transient camps, but brutal altercations claimed far more lives than illness. The local saloons operated continuously, functioning as the primary economic engines of the settlement while simultaneously serving as the focal points for daily bloodshed. Control over this highly lucrative, unregulated environment belonged entirely to an entrenched criminal syndicate directed by 3 brothers known as the Manning brothers. James Frank and George Felix Doc Manning recognized the immense financial potential of the expanding railroad hub and systematically monopolized the local vice trades. They did not arrive as desperate outlaws, but rather as calculating, well-funded organizers who understood how to extract maximum profit from human weakness. They established a sprawling, fortified entertainment complex called the Coliseum, which served as the central headquarters for their sprawling illicit operations. The Coliseum dwarfed the surrounding adobe structures, boasting a long mahogany bar shipped in at great expense, dozens of green felt gambling tables, and a large theatrical stage. The Mannings controlled the flow of watered whiskey, managed the vast networks of prostitution operating out of the rear cribs, and oversaw high-stakes faro and poker games where drunken laborers were routinely stripped of their entire monthly earnings. Men who complained of rigged decks or short-changed winnings were swiftly beaten down by the small army of loyal enforcers the brothers kept on permanent payroll. The syndicate's power extended far beyond the thick wooden doors of the Coliseum. The Mannings operated a sophisticated protection racket, offering safe haven and logistical support to organized bands of cattle rustlers and stagecoach robbers who utilized the porous international border to evade federal pursuit. Stolen Mexican livestock was driven across the river, rebranded in hidden corrals controlled by the syndicate, and sold to the incoming railroad camps at massive markups. The profits from these diverse criminal streams allowed the brothers to completely subvert the local political and judicial systems. They achieved absolute immunity by financing the campaigns of corrupt local officials and ensuring their own loyal gunmen populated the ranks of the municipal police force. Any legitimate arrest warrants issued against syndicate members conveniently disappeared from the courthouse files. Grand juries, intimidated or directly bribed by Manning operatives, consistently refused to hand down indictments regardless of the available evidence or the number of civilian witnesses. The town functioned under a dark, oppressive shadow of extortion, where speaking out against the Coliseum crowd guaranteed a brutal physical reprisal or a fatal gunshot from an unseen alleyway. Murders occurred in broad daylight on El Paso Street with terrifying regularity. Intoxicated drovers and transient laborers frequently settled minor disputes with large-caliber sidearms, leaving shattered bodies bleeding out into the alkaline dust. The corrupted local deputies would simply drag the corpses onto the wooden boardwalks, rifle through the victims' pockets for loose currency, and leave the remains to stiffen under the sun until the municipal undertaker arrived with a wooden cart. No investigations were launched, no suspects were pursued, and the lethality escalated with every passing week as the syndicate's grip tightened. A small, terrified faction of legitimate merchants, bank managers, and civilian property owners desperately attempted to maintain a fragile hold on civilization. Mayor Solomon Schutz and the Municipal City Council convened in guarded, closed-door sessions, fully aware that their official titles held absolutely no authority on the street. Their businesses were actively suffering as the rampant, unchecked crime deterred wealthy investors and respectable travelers from remaining in the settlement. The council realized that utilizing the standard corrupted channels of law enforcement was entirely futile against the armed Manning faction. Previous attempts to install an independent city marshal had ended in spectacular failures. Men hired for the dangerous position either resigned within days after receiving explicit death threats pinned to their boarding house doors, or they actively accepted substantial bribes to look the other way, effectively becoming extensions of the syndicate itself. The most recent marshal, a man named Campbell, had been publicly humiliated, disarmed, and chased out of the city limits by a mob of laughing Manning enforcers. The council required a completely different caliber of individual, someone possessing the capacity for uncompromising brutality. Word reached the desperate alderman of a towering, deeply scarred former state operator currently taking independent enforcement contracts in the Central Territories. The reports detailed a man devoid of moral hesitation, possessing a terrifying proficiency with firearms, and a well-documented history of dismantling entrenched criminal elements through sheer overwhelming kinetic force. Recognizing that survival required fighting predators with a larger, more lethal predator, Mayor Schutz authorized a formal offer of employment. The drafted correspondence promised an exceptionally high monthly salary, complete operational autonomy, and the absolute authority to cleanse the streets using any necessary methods. The rattling stagecoach journey delivering Dallas Stoudenmire to the western border took over a week of punishing travel. The stout wooden carriage slammed brutally into hardened ruts, tossing the passengers against the unpadded leather seats. Dallas sat in rigid silence throughout the grueling transit, his broad shoulders occupying the space of two ordinary men. He ignored the frantic conversations of the traveling salesmen and prospective miners sharing the cramped cabin. His pale, unblinking eyes focused entirely on the shifting, desolate landscape rolling past the dust-caked windows. When the exhausted team of horses finally pulled the coach onto the main thoroughfare of El Paso, the vehicle came to a groaning, squeaking halt in front of the municipal building. The thick cloud of dirt kicked up by the arrival slowly drifted away, settling onto the shoulders of the loitering crowds. The carriage door swung open and the towering figure stepped down onto the unpaved street. The sheer physical scale of the new arrival caused a noticeable drop in the ambient noise level of the bustling avenue. Dallas stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, his dense, muscled frame draped in a long, dark broadcloth coat. The garment was worn at the edges but meticulously clean, failing entirely to conceal the bulk of the twin Smith & Wesson revolvers riding high and forward on his hips. These weapons were custom-fitted into specialized leather rigs designed for maximum draw speed, the wooden grips polished smooth by years of constant handling. A wide-brimmed, flat-crowned hat cast a deep shadow over his angular-lined face, hiding everything but the cold, calculating intensity of his stare. Gamblers leaning against the porch pillars of the nearby saloons stopped tossing their coins. Laborers stepped back from the boardwalk, instinctively yielding the right of way to the imposing stranger. The manning lookouts posted outside the Coliseum took careful, silent measure of the new variable entering their territory. Dallas completely ignored the intense scrutiny of the street. He did not adjust his weapons or acknowledge the stares. He simply turned and walked with a stiff, deliberate, ground-eating stride directly toward the thick wooden doors of the town hall. Inside the dimly lit council chambers, the air felt dense with nervous perspiration and stale cigar smoke. Mayor Schutz and the assembled aldermen sat around a sturdy oak table, their faces lined with chronic stress and deep-seated fear. When the tall doors swung open and the imposing figure filled the frame, a tense silence gripped the room. The contrast between the soft, well-fed politicians and the hardened killer standing before them was stark and undeniable. Dallas stepped into the center of the room, keeping his hands entirely clear of his waistline, his pale eyes slowly scanning the faces of his prospective employers. The ensuing negotiation was brief, blunt, and devoid of any political pleasantries. Mayor Schutz detailed the severe nature of the syndicate's control, the rampant daily murders, and the total failure of the local deputies to maintain even a facade of order. He explained the council's deep desperation and the high financial compensation authorized for the position of city marshal. Dallas listened in complete silence, his expression remaining an unreadable mask of cold stone. When the mayor finished his plea, the towering enforcer stated his own rigid, non-negotiable terms in a low, rumbling voice that carried the weight of a physical threat. He demanded absolute, unchallenged autonomy over the streets. There would be no political interference in his methods, no civilian oversight committees questioning his tactics, and absolutely no reprimands for the deployment of lethal force against armed resistance. He informed the trembling aldermen that he would not waste time attempting to arrest men who would simply be freed by corrupted judges the following morning. If the council truly desired a clean settlement, they had to accept that the process would involve a highly visible increase in bloodshed before any form of lasting order could be established. The terrified politicians, possessing no viable alternatives and facing the total collapse of their investments, quickly agreed to the extreme demands. Mayor Schutz reached into a desk drawer and produced a 5-pointed silver star. He pushed the piece of stamped metal across the polished oak table. Dallas picked up the badge, examining the crude engraving for a brief second before pinning it firmly to the thick wool of his vest. The physical act of securing the symbol formalized the contract, transforming the independent gunman into the sole authorized instrument of municipal force within the city limits. The swearing-in procedure lacked any formal ceremony or audience. It was a dark, desperate transaction executed in the shadows by men who fully understood the catastrophic chain of events they had just initiated. The council had officially outsourced their survival to a man deeply conditioned by years of relentless warfare and frontier combat. As Dallas turned and exited the chamber, the wooden doors echoing loudly behind him, the aldermen exchanged grim, silent glances. They had successfully acquired their enforcer, but they harbored deep, lingering doubts regarding their ability to control the weapon they had just unleashed into the hostile environment. Stepping back out into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun, the new city marshal stood on the elevated wooden boardwalk. He took a long, slow breath of the dry, alkaline air, tasting the sharp, metallic tang of impending conflict. He did not seek out a boarding house or report to the local jail facility to inspect the holding cells. Instead, he stepped down into the deep, rutted dirt of El Paso Street, his boots crunching loudly against the scattered debris. He turned his broad shoulders and began walking a slow, deliberate patrol directly toward the towering facade of the Coliseum Saloon. The street parted before him like a physical wave. Men scrambled out of his path, pressing their backs firmly against the hot adobe walls to avoid any accidental contact with the armed giant. The atmosphere grew incredibly tense, the regular chaotic noise of the boomtown fading into a hushed, anticipatory silence. The enforcers lounging on the saloon porches slowly dropped their hands toward their own holstered weapons, their posture shifting from relaxed arrogance to rigid, highly focused aggression. The syndicate foot soldiers recognized the silver star pinned to the dark vest, but more importantly, they recognized the cold, predatory intent radiating from the man wearing it. Dallas stopped 50 feet from the wide double doors of the Coliseum. He planted his boots shoulder-width apart in the center of the avenue, standing entirely exposed in the blinding sunlight. He hooked his large thumbs behind the thick leather of his gun belt, his fingers resting millimeters away from the polished grips of his twin revolvers. He did not issue a verbal challenge or shout a warning to the men watching him from the shadows of the wooden awning. He simply stood there, an immovable obstruction challenging the total authority of the ruling criminal faction. Inside the sprawling saloon, word rapidly spread to the private back rooms where the Manning brothers conducted their daily operations. Jim Manning, the calculating architect of the syndicate, stepped out onto the elevated interior balcony overlooking the crowded gambling floor. He peered through the thick haze of cigar smoke, looking out the open front doors to observe the figure standing motionless in the street. He noted the size of the man, the low-slung leather rigs, and the unnatural confidence required to stand alone against dozens of armed operatives. Jim understood instantly that the city council had fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. The silent standoff in the dust lasted for several agonizing minutes. The oppressive heat beat down on the wool coats, but Dallas remained completely motionless. His pale eyes locked onto the dark interior of the saloon. He was actively mapping the tactical layout of the street, noting the elevated firing positions on the flat adobe roofs, and calculating the distance to the nearest solid cover. He was conditioning the street to his presence, forcefully projecting his authority and daring the syndicate to make the first aggressive move. The tension stretched tight enough to snap, vibrating with the unspoken promise of massive retaliation. Eventually, the Manning enforcers on the porch slowly backed away, retreating into the loud, chaotic safety of the saloon interior. They were not cowed, but they were unwilling to initiate a gun battle against an unknown adversary without direct orders from the brothers. Dallas maintained his position for another full minute after the porch cleared, ensuring his dominance over the physical space was completely absolute and unchallenged. Only then did he slowly pivot on his heel, resuming his methodical patrol down the rutted thoroughfare, his boots leaving deep, definitive tracks in the alkaline sand. The silent confrontation served as the definitive opening maneuver in an uncompromising campaign for control. Dallas spent his first 48 hours systematically mapping the dark alleys, locating the hidden entrances to the illegal cribs and identifying the key players operating within the syndicate's hierarchy. He did not sleep, subsisting entirely on black coffee and the raw adrenaline coursing through his hardwired nervous system. He moved through the dangerous, crowded spaces like a predatory shadow, constantly visible but entirely unapproachable, deeply unsettling the criminal element with his cold, unblinking scrutiny. The era of corrupted deputies and paid-off marshals had officially terminated. The city council had desired a monster to fight their monsters, and the towering figure patrolling the boardwalks exceeded their most terrifying expectations. The deep, systemic corruption that had flourished unchecked for years now faced a rigidly inflexible opposing force. The sprawling border town held its collective breath, the scent of stale beer and horse manure thoroughly replaced by the sharp, acidic tang of burnt powder and impending slaughter. The stage was perfectly set for a catastrophic collision between the entrenched, wealthy syndicate and the solitary enforcer hired to completely break them. April 14, 1881. The morning sun rapidly heated the baked mud walls of El Paso, scorching the pale dirt of the avenues and escalating the pre-existing tension gripping the settlement. A highly volatile dispute had been brewing for several days, following the discovery of two murdered Mexican vaqueros. These ranch hands had been found shot to death near the property of John Hale, a prominent local livestock manager and an entrenched associate of the ruling criminal syndicate. The local authorities convened a formal inquest inside the municipal courtroom to determine the circumstances of the double homicide, drawing a large armed crowd of interested parties. Constable Gus Krempkow, a bilingual lawman who frequently operated alongside the municipal courts, provided the crucial Spanish translations during the legal proceedings. The sworn testimony presented before the judge strongly implicated several of Hale's personal employees in the killings. The final judicial ruling officially recognized the murders as criminal acts warranting further pursuit, a decision that deeply infuriated the ranch manager. He viewed the inquest as a direct challenge to the syndicate's operational impunity and directed his intense, alcohol-fueled rage squarely at Krempkow, blaming the constable's translations for the unfavorable legal outcome. Following the adjournment of the morning session, Hale exited the courtroom and proceeded directly to Keating's Saloon, a popular drinking establishment located on the main avenue. He was accompanied by George Campbell, a former city marshal who maintained deep ties to the Manning faction and harbored his own intense resentments toward the current municipal administration. The two men consumed copious quantities of poorly distilled whiskey, their anger compounding with every glass. The harsh alcohol rapidly eroded their impulse control, transforming their political frustrations into a localized aggression demanding a physical outlet. Shortly after the midday hour, Constable Krempkow walked down the wooden boardwalk, approaching the vicinity of Keating's Saloon. He carried a rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm, unaware of the targeted hostility waiting for him. As Krempkow passed the open saloon doors, Campbell stepped out into the blinding sunlight, blocking the lawman's path. A loud, highly aggressive verbal altercation commenced. Campbell began shouting loud profanities, accusing Krempkow of manipulating the morning's testimony to frame Hale's men. The raised voices echoed off the flat adobe facades, drawing the attention of dozens of transient laborers and gamblers lounging on the nearby porches. Krempkow stopped, shifting his weight and tightening his grip on his rifle. He vehemently denied the accusations, stating loudly that he only translated the spoken words and had no personal stake in the judicial ruling. The constable attempted to disengage from the escalating confrontation, turning his body to continue his patrol down the avenue. The highly intoxicated John Hale emerged from the shadowed interior of the saloon at that precise moment. Enraged by the sight of the lawman turning his back, Hale lunged forward, his hand plunging toward his waistline to retrieve his holstered sidearm. The physical mechanics of the ensuing attack occurred with terrifying speed. Hale snatched one of Campbell's large-caliber revolvers, leveled the iron barrel directly at Krempkow's torso, and pulled the trigger. The weapon detonated with a deafening roar, expelling a dense cloud of white sulfuric smoke into the stagnant desert air. The metallic projectile struck Krempkow squarely in the chest, penetrating his canvas shirt and shattering his ribs. The kinetic force of the impact drove the constable backward off the elevated boardwalk. He collapsed onto the deep, alkaline dust of the roadway, his rifle clattering uselessly onto the dirt as bright crimson fluid began rapidly soaking through his clothing. Directly across the wide corridor, Dallas Stoudenmire was seated inside the Globe restaurant, consuming his midday meal. The sudden concussive blast of the gunshot shattered the relative quiet of the dining room. Stoudenmire reacted with the ingrained mechanical precision of a highly conditioned predator. He dropped his metal utensils, kicking his wooden chair backward so forcefully it splintered against the wall. He bolted toward the exit, his immense frame tearing through the swinging doors and launching out onto the boardwalk in a fraction of a second. Emerging into the bright sunlight, the city marshal's pale eyes rapidly scanned the chaotic scene across the avenue. He visually processed the billowing white smoke, the bleeding body of Constable Krempkow writhing in the dirt, and the figures of Hale and Campbell standing aggressively near the saloon entrance. His central nervous system flooded with raw adrenaline, hyper-accelerating his perception of the unfolding chaos. Without slowing his forward momentum, Stoudenmire's hands moved to his hips, executing a flawless, synchronized draw of his twin large-caliber sidearms. He initiated a rapid advance across the rutted street, closing the distance between himself and the active shooters. As he moved, he raised his right revolver, acquiring John Hale as his primary target. He pulled the hammer backward with his thumb, locking the internal sear, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon fired, sending a spherical projectile screaming across the dusty expanse. However, Hale, reacting to the sudden appearance of the towering lawman, panicked and lunged sideways toward the cover of a stout adobe pillar supporting the saloon's awning. The slight shift in Hale's position altered the lethal trajectory of Stoudenmire's first shot. The round missed its intended mark by mere inches. Simultaneously, an unarmed Mexican citizen, completely unconnected to the dispute, was frantically attempting to flee the erupting crossfire. The man ran directly into the path of the speeding projectile. The metal sphere struck the innocent bystander with devastating kinetic energy, penetrating his torso and destroying his vital organs. The man dropped instantly, his body slamming into the dirt, dead before his face impacted the ground. Stoudenmire did not pause or alter his forward assault after the unintended casualty. He maintained a cold, singular focus on eliminating the active threats. Hale, now terrified and desperate, huddled behind the wide column, attempting to conceal his body from the advancing marshal. He made a fatal tactical error, leaning his head slightly past the edge of the brickwork to assess Stoudenmire's position. The marshal, anticipating the movement, had already adjusted his aim, calculating exactly where the target would reappear. As Hale's face cleared the edge of the pillar, Stoudenmire fired his second round. The precision of the shot was absolute. The high-velocity projectile struck Hale directly in the center of his forehead, penetrating the cranial bone just above the brow line. The extreme internal pressure generated by the impact scrambled the frontal lobe and blew a huge exit wound through the back of Hale's skull. A gruesome spray of gray matter, bone fragments, and dark fluid painted the sun-baked wall behind him. Hale collapsed straight down, folding into a lifeless heap at the base of the column, his revolver falling from his slack fingers. The chaos escalated further as George Campbell reacted to the sudden, brutal execution of his associate. Seeing Stoudenmire advancing with smoking weapons, Campbell drew his own sidearm, stepping backward into the street to establish a clear line of sight. He raised his revolver, preparing to engage the marshal. Simultaneously, the severely wounded Constable Krempkow, bleeding profusely into the dust, managed to pull his own handgun from its holster. Operating on pure survival instinct, the dying constable leveled his weapon from the ground and fired a desperate shot upward at Campbell. Krempkow's round struck Campbell's weapon hand, shattering the delicate bones of the wrist and completely severing the tendons. The intense pain caused Campbell to drop his revolver into the dirt. He screamed, clutching his ruined extremity, completely defenseless and exposed in the center of the thoroughfare. He looked up, his face twisted in agony, and locked eyes with the towering city marshal. Stoudenmire, pivoting smoothly from the neutralized Hale, acquired Campbell as his next target, his left revolver already raised and aligned. Campbell, realizing his fatal error, yelled across the short distance, screaming that he was unarmed and pleading for a cessation of hostilities. Stoudenmire's facial expression remained entirely unchanged, a mask of cold, unyielding stone. He did not recognize surrender in the midst of an active firefight. He squeezed the trigger of his second weapon. The gun roared, expelling another dense cloud of sulfuric powder. The projectile struck Campbell squarely in the lower abdomen, punching through the muscular wall and severing his intestinal tract. The catastrophic abdominal wound folded Campbell completely in half. He dropped to his knees in the deep mud, his hands desperately clutching his torn stomach as hot biological fluid spilled onto the ground. He pitched forward, his face pressing into the pale dirt, his body convulsing as internal hemorrhaging rapidly drained his life. Within seconds, his movement ceased entirely, leaving him motionless beside the groaning, dying form of Constable Krempkow. The entire sequence of combat, from Hale's initial shot to Campbell's final collapse, transpired in less than 5 seconds. The sudden, deafening roar of the heavy-caliber weapons ceased, replaced by a profound, ringing silence that settled over El Paso Street. A massive cloud of acrid white smoke hung, stagnant in the dry air, obscuring the bright sunlight and burning the nostrils of the terrified onlookers who had dived into the alleyways for cover. 4 shattered bodies now lay bleeding out into the rutted dirt, painting the pale sand with expanding pools of crimson. Stoudenmire stood alone in the center of the thoroughfare, his broad chest heaving slightly as he drew oxygen into his lungs. He held both smoking revolvers at his sides, his thumbs systematically pulling the hammers back to half-cock. He broke open the mechanisms, exposing the empty brass casings within the cylinders. He tilted the weapons backward, allowing the spent hot brass to eject and clatter loudly against the wooden boardwalk. He reached into the leather pouches on his belt, retrieved fresh metallic cartridges, and methodically loaded the empty chambers, sliding the rounds into place with precise, practiced movements. The surviving Manning enforcers, who had witnessed the entire slaughter from the safety of the Coliseum's porch, remained paralyzed. They stared in absolute shock at the sheer speed and uncompromising brutality displayed by the new city marshal. Stoudenmire had not engaged in a traditional prolonged shootout. He had executed a rapid, calculated dismantling of multiple armed threats without sustaining a single injury. The terrifying realization that the marshal possessed the capability and the willpower to slaughter their men in broad daylight shattered their arrogant assumptions of control. After securing his reloaded weapons back into his leather rigs, Stoudenmire slowly walked over to the bodies. He confirmed Hale and Campbell were completely deceased, prodding their motionless forms with the toe of his boot. He knelt beside Constable Kremkow, observing the fatal chest wound that was rapidly claiming the lawman's life. He did not offer any false comfort. The damage was far beyond the primitive medical capabilities of the frontier settlement. He simply stood up, his pale eyes scanning the surrounding rooftops and alleyways, ensuring no further hostility was materializing from the shadows. The terrified civilian population slowly began emerging from their hiding places, their eyes wide with profound horror as they surveyed the carnage. The undertaker arrived minutes later, pushing a large wooden cart with squeaking iron wheels. He required assistance from the numb bystanders to hoist the bleeding corpses onto the flatbed. The sheer volume of biological fluid lost in the dirt created a viscous mud that adhered to the boots of the men hauling the dead. The Mexican bystander, a man who merely walked down the wrong thoroughfare at the wrong second, lay tangled alongside the very men responsible for the violence. The stark inequity of his demise resonated deeply with the civilian population, highlighting the indiscriminate, chaotic nature of the high-velocity projectiles tearing through their community. The blood dripping from the cart left a long, grim trail down the center of El Paso Street, a visual testament to the new, lethal reality imposed upon the border town. The city council alderman observed the aftermath from the reinforced windows of the municipal building. They had desired an enforcer capable of matching the syndicate's ferocity, but the sheer scale of the bloodletting deeply unnerved them. Stoudenmire had unilaterally executed two prominent figures associated with the Manning faction in a matter of seconds. The politicians realized they had authorized a force of nature that they could not possibly control or contain. The streets were indeed being cleansed, but the cost was an exponential increase in extreme public butchery. The psychological impact of the swift engagement radically altered the power dynamics of the settlement. The Manning brothers, operating from their secure back rooms, recognized that standard intimidation tactics would fail entirely against the new marshal. They could not bribe him. They could not frighten him, and engaging him in a direct open gunfight carried an unacceptably high risk of total annihilation. They were forced into a defensive posture, relying on hidden ambushes and proxy violence rather than confronting the immense enforcer face to face in the dusty avenues. Stoudenmire resumed his patrol, walking slowly past the pooling blood with his stiff-legged gait. The street remained completely devoid of any other human traffic. Men actively pressed themselves against the adobe walls as he passed, terrified of drawing his unblinking stare. He had successfully conditioned the environment through the application of overwhelming force. He owned the physical space of the thoroughfare, his presence functioning as a permanent, highly visible threat to anyone contemplating a challenge to his absolute authority. The sun began to set behind the jagged peaks of the Franklin Mountains, casting long, shadowy fingers across the bullet-scarred adobe walls. The temperature dropped rapidly, cooling the dried blood caked onto the dirt. As the cart was dragged toward the municipal graveyard, Stoudenmire did not follow. He returned to the Globe restaurant, the establishment he had abruptly abandoned minutes prior. The interior was completely deserted, the patrons having fled through the rear exits during the deafening roar of the gunfire. His splintered wooden chair remained on the floorboards, his unfinished meal resting on the table, rapidly cooling. He righted the damaged chair, sat down, and calmly requested a fresh cup of black coffee from the terrified proprietor hiding behind the kitchen counter. His heart rate had already decelerated to a normal rhythm. his internal system efficiently processing the dump of combat adrenaline. This complete lack of emotional reaction to the extreme violence further solidified his terrifying reputation. He did not seek validation, he did not boast to the local reporters, and he did not require alcohol to steady his nerves. He simply resumed his daily routine as if he had merely swatted away a nuisance. The syndicate spies observing him through the restaurant windows reported this unnatural calmness back to the Manning brothers, increasing their deep-seated paranoia. They were dealing with an adversary who fundamentally lacked standard human psychological vulnerabilities. The deep night settled over the border town, but the usual raucous noise emanating from the saloons was noticeably subdued. The piano players kept their music at low volumes, and the gambling tables operated in tense, hushed whispers. The massive stain in the center of El Paso Street served as a grim warning to every transient laborer and drunken drover. No one dared to discharge a firearm into the air or initiate a physical brawl on the boardwalks, deeply terrified that the towering marshal would materialize from the shadows and end their lives with the same terrifying speed he had demonstrated that afternoon. The municipal city council, attempting to capitalize on the sudden suppression of street crime, drafted formal notices prohibiting the carrying of sidearms within the city limits. They pasted these paper declarations onto the wooden pillars of the town hall. However, the politicians fully understood that these written laws were entirely meaningless without the physical presence of their hired enforcer to back them up. Stoudenmire was the sole mechanism enforcing the disarmament, confiscating weapons from arriving stagecoach passengers and armed cattlemen with cold, uncompromising efficiency. He operated entirely alone, refusing to deputize any local men, recognizing that the deep roots of corruption rendered anyone in the settlement untrustworthy. This solitary existence forced him to maintain an extreme level of hypervigilance 24 hours a day. He varied his patrol routes constantly, never eating in the same establishment 2 days in a row, and sleeping in completely darkened rooms with his holstered rigs placed directly across his chest. He knew the Manning syndicate possessed vast financial resources and a deep bench of loyal killers, and he understood they would not allow the public humiliation of the afternoon's gunfight to remain unanswered for long. The tension radiating through the alkaline dust was palpable, a vibrating pressure pressing down on the adobe structures. The settlement had traded the chaotic daily murders of the syndicate era for a rigid, militarized occupation enforced by a single individual. The 4 bodies buried in the dry earth marked the definitive end of the old power structure, but they also guaranteed a brutal, protracted struggle for absolute control. As the desert winds howled through the dark alleyways, Dallas Stoudenmire stood watch, a deeply scarred apex predator guarding a highly corrupted territory, fully prepared to deploy his catastrophic violence the second the syndicate dared to strike back. April 17th, 1881. The mood across El Paso hardened into a palpable, crushing pressure following the prior week's bloodshed. The local crime faction convened in hushed, continuous sessions behind the locked, reinforced doors of the Coliseum saloon. Their established methods of municipal dominance, previously reliant on bribing weak politicians and physically threatening unarmed merchants, had utterly shattered against the unyielding brutality of the newly appointed town marshal. They required a drastic, permanent solution to eliminate this imposing obstacle to their immensely profitable illicit operations. The men realized their carefully constructed criminal enterprise of vice and extortion was failing rapidly under the scrutiny of a single individual. Jim Manning, acting as the primary strategist for the organized criminals, recognized the absolute futility of launching a direct assault in the open street, ordering his loyal salaried gunmen to draw their weapons against an exceptionally trained adversary guaranteed massive, unacceptable casualties and a high probability of total operational failure. The ruling brothers needed to orchestrate an assassination without exposing their core, valuable members to reciprocal injury. They opted to employ an entirely disposable proxy, a deniable human asset easily manipulated into executing an ambush from a concealed safe position. The siblings selected a local vagabond named Bill Johnson for the dangerous task. Johnson occupied the absolute bottom of the frontier social ladder, an older man entirely consumed by decades of chronic alcoholism. He spent his days wandering the commercial district, aggressively begging for small coins from passing laborers just to purchase cheap, corrosive spirits. His physical condition was profoundly degraded. His hands shook constantly from chemical withdrawal, his face remained permanently flushed with broken capillaries, and his unwashed, torn clothing hung loosely over a malnourished, fragile skeletal frame. Johnson harbored a specific, distinctly exploitable grudge against the current law enforcement administration. Before the tall lawman arrived, the drunken scavenger occasionally received insignificant sums of currency from corrupt deputies to perform menial cleanup tasks or act as a nighttime lookout for various illicit properties. The new marshal had aggressively terminated these informal paid arrangements, threatening Johnson with brutal physical eviction if he continued to loiter near the municipal buildings. The Mannings capitalized heavily on this localized resentment, summoning the trembling addict directly into their opulent private back office. Inside the dimly lit, smoke-filled room, a tall glass of premium high-proof whiskey was poured and placed onto a polished mahogany desk. Johnson consumed the dark, potent liquid swiftly, his severe muscular tremors temporarily subsiding as the harsh alcohol forcefully entered his bloodstream. The faction leaders began a coldly calculated psychological manipulation. They actively fueled his lingering anger, assuring the vagabond that the new authority figure viewed him as nothing more than a disgusting nuisance to be forcefully eradicated from the streets of the growing border settlement. They promised Johnson an endless, absolutely free supply of premium liquor and a substantial life-altering financial reward if he simply agreed to pull a trigger on their behalf. To guarantee the success of the cowardly ambush, the Mannings provided him with a devastating close-quarters weapon. They retrieved a short-barreled, double-barreled shotgun from their extensive private armory. This specific firearm was exclusively designed for absolute untargeted destruction at a very short range, possessing dual steel tubes bored exceptionally wide to accommodate immense, thick brass casings. Each massive casing held a stout, heavy charge of volatile black powder and a brutal load of buckshot. Firing both barrels simultaneously would project a wide, devastatingly lethal cone of flying metal capable of tearing a human target violently apart in a fraction of a second. The organized faction also determined the precise, optimal location for the assassination attempt. A short distance down the main commercial corridor, an incomplete construction project offered an ideal, elevated vantage point perfectly suited for a hidden shooter. A tightly stacked, massive pile of baked clay bricks sat adjacent to the unpaved roadway, intended for the future erection of a new mercantile storefront. This dense, unyielding structural material provided excellent physical cover, entirely capable of stopping high-velocity revolver rounds from penetrating. Crucially, the bricks were situated directly along the primary patrol route the town marshal utilized during his solitary evening inspections of the settlement. The location offered a clear, unobstructed line of sight into the center of the avenue while obscuring the attacker in deep shadows. As the sun descended behind the rugged western peaks, casting long, distorting shadows across the uneven dirt streets, the final preparations for the ambush commenced. The operative supplied Johnson with another full bottle of harsh, cheap liquor to falsely fortify his fractured nerves, instructing him to conceal himself behind the brick pile and wait patiently for the target to walk past. The drunken proxy stumbled out of the saloon's rear exit, clutching the stout shotgun tightly against his chest, his mind profoundly clouded by the excessive consumption of strong spirits. The evening temperature dropped sharply, causing a dry, biting wind to swirl through the empty, debris-filled alleys. Johnson reached the quiet construction site and wedged his frail, trembling body into the narrow space directly behind the stacked clay. The rough, abrasive surface of the baked mud scraped harshly against his ragged wool coat. He placed the dual muzzles carefully over the top layer of bricks, pointing the dark, empty tubes toward the center of the avenue. He pulled the twin hammers backward until they clicked loudly into the locked, ready position. His dirty index finger rested nervously against the cold metal of the front trigger. Waiting silently in the cold, stagnant night air proved exceptionally detrimental to the alcoholic's already compromised physical state. The potent, unrefined liquor he consumed earlier began to drastically impair his basic cognitive functions, and fine motor control even further. His peripheral vision blurred significantly at the edges, and the uncontrollable tremors returned to his weakened hands as the intense desert chill seeped deeply into his arthritic joints and thin bloodstream. The sheer, unbalanced weight of the heavy shotgun became increasingly difficult for him to support for a prolonged duration. Exhausted, he allowed the front of the heavy iron barrels to slowly dip downward, resting the cold steel entirely against the very top edge of the brick stack to relieve the burning strain in his shoulders. Several blocks away, Dallas Stoudenmire commenced his rigid nightly patrol. He stepped out of his darkened boarding house, the dual, fully loaded handguns riding securely in their custom leather holsters. The entire settlement was unnaturally quiet, a direct, chilling consequence of the overwhelming lethal force deployed just 3 days prior. The various saloons continued to operate internally, but the patrons remained firmly indoors, absolutely terrified of straying into the dark thoroughfares. The imposing lawman walked with a slow, highly deliberate rhythm, his heavy boot heels striking the wooden boardwalks and echoing loudly off the flat storefront facades. He operated in a permanent state of intense sensory awareness, deeply distrusting the deceptive calm of the border town. His unblinking stare systematically scanned the pitch-black recesses located between the adjacent structures, actively searching for any slight, unexpected movement or unnatural shadow cast against the walls. He possessed an acute, finely refined auditory perception, deeply conditioned by years of actively hunting hostile outlaws in the silent, unforgiving wilderness. As he turned onto the main commercial corridor and approached the quiet construction zone, his highly conditioned senses instantly detected a subtle, completely abnormal sound drifting faintly on the cold night wind. He cataloged every creak of timber and rustle of wind-blown debris, separating natural environmental noise from human activity. It was the ragged, wet noise of a man drawing sharp, desperate breaths through an alcohol-soaked throat. The distinct rhythmic sound emanated directly from the large stack of building materials positioned precisely 30 yards ahead on his right flank. Stoudenmire did not suddenly halt his forward progress, nor did he alter his slow, deliberate pacing. To abruptly stop or instinctively retreat would loudly signal his awareness to the hidden attacker, and likely trigger a panicked, premature assault from an unseen angle. He maintained a facade of total ignorance while his internal combat systems fully engaged. Instead, he smoothly and seamlessly shifted his walking trajectory, stepping quietly off the echoing, resonant wooden boardwalk and down into the soft, sound-dampening dirt of the main street. The slight, calculated shift in the marshal's physical positioning fundamentally altered the geometric angles of the impending ambush. Johnson, huddled tightly behind the bricks and desperately struggling to maintain his focus through the dense, debilitating fog of profound intoxication, heard the rhythmic footsteps on the boardwalk suddenly cease without any warning. The unexpected silence thoroughly confused the waiting proxy. Blind panic quickly overwhelmed the vagrant's diminished, alcohol-soaked mind. He peered over the top of the stacked clay, his blurry, unfocused vision frantically attempting to locate the large human target in the dim, unreliable moonlight. He eventually spotted the dark, imposing silhouette advancing silently through the precise center of the uneven roadway, fully off the anticipated path. Johnson reacted with sheer uncoordinated desperation, forcefully yanking both stiff triggers of the double-barreled shotgun simultaneously, before properly aiming the weapon. He bypassed all rational thought, driven purely by fear and the promise of a monetary reward. The immense double-barreled weapon detonated with an earth-shaking, catastrophic blast. A colossal, blinding tongue of bright orange fire erupted from the twin muzzles, illuminating the dark street in a momentary flash of pure light. However, because his violently trembling hands had previously allowed the heavy steel barrels to sag downward, resting firmly against the top layer of the stack, the lethal trajectory of the blast was critically and fatally compromised from the very moment of ignition. The weapon was pointed slightly downward instead of parallel to the ground. The enormous, highly concentrated charge of expanding black powder gas and a brutal load of buckshot slammed directly into the clay bricks located mere inches from the muzzles. The immense, uncontained mechanical energy instantly pulverized the baked mud. A devastating, chaotic explosion of sharp clay shrapnel, pulverized dirt dust, and deformed metal pellets erupted forcefully upward into the night sky, entirely destroying the top portion of the carefully constructed cover. The deafening noise reverberated through the entire town, shattering the tense silence. The concussive, invisible shockwave of the misfired weapon hit Stoudenmire physically, peppering his long dark coat with completely harmless microscopic fragments of shattered brick and hot ash, but the lethal payload of steel shot missed his physical body entirely, flying harmlessly over his head. The backward reciprocal force generated by discharging both barrels of a double-barreled shotgun simultaneously was brutally punishing, capable of bruising the shoulder of even a healthy, fully grown individual prepared for the recoil. It delivered a brutal kinetic kick straight into the shooter's frame. For the frail, deeply intoxicated vagrant, the massive recoil proved thoroughly overwhelming. The stout wooden stock of the shotgun slammed viciously into Johnson's thin shoulder, instantly shattering his fragile collarbone and launching his entire malnourished body forcefully backward into the loose dirt. The heavy weapon flew forcefully out of his ruined hands, clattering uselessly into the darkness behind the construction site, as he writhed helplessly on the ground in sudden, agonizing, blinding pain. His ambush had failed spectacularly, leaving him entirely disarmed and severely injured. Stoudenmire's physiological reaction to the sudden, deafening explosion was totally devoid of any normal human panic or surprise. The precise instant the bright orange flash illuminated the brick pile, his large hands moved with blinding, highly practiced speed. He cleared the customized leather holsters, leveling both of his handguns before the echoing roar of the shotgun blast had even faded from the empty avenue. He advanced swiftly, closing the distance toward the drifting cloud of pulverized clay. His unblinking stare aggressively tracked the thrashing movement located just behind the compromised barricade. The lawman possessed a clear, entirely unobstructed line of sight onto the incapacitated proxy groveling in the dirt. He did not issue a loud verbal command to surrender, nor did he pause for a single second to identify the specific individual who had just initiated the lethal attempt on his life. The execution of an intensely aggressive, kinetic, and permanent response was deeply hardwired into his nervous system through years of relentless frontier combat. A threat was a threat, and it had to be eliminated entirely. He fluidly raised his right sidearm, locked the heavy hammer backward with his thumb, aligned the front iron sights onto the dark, rolling mass on the ground, and squeezed the trigger without hesitation. The high-velocity projectile tore cleanly through the cold night air, striking Johnson with absolute pinpoint precision. The metal sphere impacted the vagrant's lower pelvic region, punching brutally through the dirty wool of his trousers and thoroughly shattering the dense bone of the hip socket. The impact physically jolted the man's body against the dirt. The profound traumatic transfer of energy caused Johnson to involuntarily emit a high-pitched, guttural scream of absolute agony. His frail body convulsed wildly in the shadows, his hands desperately and uselessly clutching at his ruined lower extremities. As bright crimson fluid began pooling steadily in the powdery dirt beneath him. Stoudenmire did not cease his forward assault or lower his weapons, maintaining a steady, precisely calculated rate of advance, while transitioning his focus seamlessly to his left revolver. He stepped over the scattered debris, closing in for the final, definitive action. He fired a second round, sending another lethal metal sphere screaming down into the wounded target. This specific projectile struck Johnson squarely in the lower abdomen, easily penetrating the soft abdominal tissue and tearing violently through the intestinal tract. The profound, catastrophic internal damage folded the vagrant's body inward upon itself, his loud screams swiftly dissolving into a series of wet, choking, horrific gasps as hot biological fluids thoroughly flooded his throat and lung cavities. The brutal reality of the gunshot wounds quickly overwhelmed his weakened biological systems. The tall enforcer closed the final remaining distance, coming to a complete halt merely 10 feet away from the dying, bleeding man. The thick, acrid smoke from the detonated black powder hung stagnant and heavy over the entire scene, mixing thoroughly with the sharp, metallic copper scent of freshly spilled blood. Stoudenmire looked down at the shattered form of Bill Johnson, instantly recognizing the town drunk and quickly deducing the cowardly, manipulative mechanics behind the failed assassination attempt. The pieces of the syndicate's desperate puzzle fell perfectly into place within his analytical mind. He understood with absolute clarity that the local criminal faction had manipulated a weak, desperately vulnerable, and intoxicated individual into serving as their totally expendable instrument of execution. This grim realization did not generate any form of pity, mercy, or hesitation within the hardened marshal. In the brutal, uncompromising logic of the Western frontier, an armed, active threat required total, permanent neutralization, entirely regardless of the attacker's impaired mental state or pathetic social standing. Sympathy was a luxury that men operating in this violent environment simply could not afford. Stoudenmire coldly raised his right weapon one final time, leveling the smoking iron barrel directly at Johnson's convulsing, bleeding torso. He pulled the trigger firmly, delivering a final, lethal projectile that easily severed the vagrant's spinal column and instantly terminated all remaining biological functions. The sudden, definitive cessation of gunfire returned the main commercial avenue to a profound, ringing, eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the wind howling through the bullet-scarred adobe structures. The threat was permanently extinguished, leaving only the grim aftermath of the one-sided encounter. Stoudenmire stood silently over the ruined corpse, his broad chest rising and falling rhythmically as his heart rate normalized. He systematically broke open the cylinders of his revolvers, ejecting the hot, empty brass casings onto the blood-soaked dirt. He retrieved fresh cartridges from his leather belt pouches and reloaded the weapons with practiced mechanical efficiency. He holstered the firearms, his facial expression remaining an entirely unreadable cold mask of stone, purposefully leaving the body precisely where it fell as a profoundly visceral, undeniable warning to the watching cartel. The streets belonged to him, and the price of challenging that ownership was total annihilation. May 1881. The relentless transition into the summer season scorched the western Texas landscape, baking the mud brick structures of El Paso until the thick walls radiated intense heat long after sunset. The severe purges executed during the previous month had fundamentally altered the sonic environment of the remote border settlement. The ceaseless, chaotic roar of unregulated gambling, drunken brawls, and random gunfire evaporated from the dusty thoroughfares. In its place, a tense, deeply uncomfortable silence settled over the commercial district. The local population walked with their heads down, actively avoiding eye contact and speaking only in muted whispers. The organized criminal syndicate, thoroughly traumatized by the rapid execution of their top operatives and the catastrophic failure of their proxy assassin, abandoned the open streets. The Manning brothers withdrew their enforcers into the reinforced interiors of their saloons, barricading the stout wooden doors and posting vigilant lookouts at the second-story windows. They recognized that asserting dominance in the public square invited an overwhelming, highly lethal retaliation. Dallas Stoudenmire had successfully claimed undisputed ownership of the physical avenues, transforming the sprawling, lawless boomtown into a rigidly controlled military occupation zone governed exclusively by his solitary presence. He initiated an uncompromising, brutal campaign to forcibly disarm the entire transient and civilian population residing within the city limits. The municipal council had previously posted paper notices prohibiting the carrying of sidearms, but these printed warnings lacked any physical weight or actual enforcement. Stoudenmire became the ruthless living enforcement mechanism of that specific mandate. He positioned his towering frame at the primary stagecoach stops and the main thoroughfares leading from the expanding railroad camps, systematically intercepting every arriving traveler, wealthy livestock drover, and hardened drifter seeking entry into the community. His confiscation methods were entirely devoid of common courtesy, polite requests, or any form of verbal negotiation. When a large group of armed cattlemen rode into the settlement covered in thick trail dust and expecting a chaotic night of drinking, Stoudenmire stepped directly into the path of their tired horses. He demanded the absolute surrender of all firearms. His pale eyes locked onto the riders, his calloused hands resting firmly near his own holstered weapons. The drovers, accustomed to deeply intimidating weak rural deputies, initially scoffed at the solitary man blocking their path. The marshal's response to their arrogant hesitation was blindingly fast and intensely ferocious. When one vocal rider cursed and reached slowly toward his leather saddle scabbard, Stoudenmire closed the short distance in 2 massive strides. He grabbed the thick bridle of the horse with his left hand, forcefully jerking the animal downward. Simultaneously, his right hand drew his large revolver and swung the thick steel barrel in a vicious upward arc. The metal slammed into the rider's jawbone with a sickening crunch, shattering white teeth and fracturing the mandible. The man tumbled sideways out of his saddle, spitting blood and bone fragments into the dirt. The remaining cattlemen stared in absolute shock at their bleeding companion writhing on the hard ground. Stoudenmire did not raise his voice, draw his second weapon, or issue a second verbal warning. He simply held his drawn sidearm steady, his facial expression an unreadable mask of cold stone. The terrified riders hurriedly unbuckled their heavy leather gun belts, dropping their expensive revolvers and lever-action rifles into the alkaline dust at the marshal's boots. He gathered the surrendered weaponry, hauling the hefty pile of iron and brass to the municipal jail, leaving the disarmed, thoroughly cowed men to tend to their injured associate. This proactive, highly physical suppression eradicated the casual street crime that had plagued the town for years. Stoudenmire then turned his aggressive focus toward the sprawling, unsanitary transient camps clinging like parasites to the edges of the settlement. These filthy collections of canvas tents and scrap lumber housed hundreds of displaced laborers and opportunistic thieves who preyed upon the incoming railroad wages. The marshal waded into the squalid encampments alone, utilizing raw physical intimidation and the threat of lethal force to systematically dismantle the chaotic shanty towns. He kicked over their cast-iron cooking fires, scattering burning embers across the dry dirt and igniting small brush fires. He tore down the flimsy canvas shelters with his bare hands, completely ignoring the angry shouts and desperate pleas of the displaced occupants. when a group of hardened railroad workers attempted to surround him, gripping heavy iron track, spikes, and thick wooden clubs. Stoudenmire simply drew both of his sidearms and cocked the thick hammers. The sharp, mechanical clicking echoing in the tight confines of the camp instantly broke their collective resolve. He ordered them to pack their meager belongings and march out of the city limits, watching coldly as the massive defeated crowd trudged away into the barren, sun-baked desert. By June 1881, the physical transformation of El Paso was absolute. The rutted dirt avenues were completely devoid of loiterers, vagrants, and armed predators. However, this sterile, forced compliance carried a severe, highly damaging economic consequence for the booming frontier hub. The sprawling saloons and loud gambling halls, previously the primary financial engines of the settlement, now sat largely empty. Transient laborers, terrified of the towering enforcer constantly patrolling the boardwalks, bypassed the town altogether. They chose instead to spend their hard-earned wages in neighboring jurisdictions where the lucrative vice trades operated freely without the constant threat of sudden, lethal violence. The Manning brothers watched their immense daily profits rapidly dwindle to a mere fraction of their former volume. Their opulent green faro tables gathered dust. Their expensive imported liquor remained securely sealed inside wooden barrels, and their extensive network of illegal cribs sat entirely vacant. The criminal syndicate was financially hemorrhaging, their extensive power base slowly dissolving under the crushing weight of the marshal's uncompromising occupation. Their initial anger morphed into a deep, festering hatred, but the vivid, terrifying memory of the April slaughter kept their violent impulses firmly in check. They could only wait in the shadows, hoping the extreme stress of the position would eventually cause their adversary to psychologically fracture. A distinctly similar sentiment began quietly brewing within the municipal city council. Mayor Solomon Schutz and the wealthy aldermen had hired a monster to exterminate their pests, but they now realized the harsh cure was actively destroying the fragile patient. The respectable merchants who had loudly demanded law and order were now complaining bitterly to the administration. Commercial freight wagons were actively rerouting their supply lines just to avoid the strict weapons confiscations. Legitimate travelers felt deeply unsettled by the grim, heavily armed giant who stalked the wooden boardwalks like a predatory shadow. The politicians recognized that a thriving frontier economy required a highly delicate balance of regulated vice, and their hired enforcer possessed zero capacity for political nuance or compromise. During a tense closed-door session in July 1881, the city council attempted to formally rein in their rogue marshal. They drafted a series of new municipal ordinances designed to heavily restrict his operational autonomy, demanding detailed written reports for every confiscated weapon, and requiring prior council approval before he could physically expel individuals from the town boundaries. Mayor Schutz nervously summoned Stoudenmire into the stuffy, wood-paneled chambers, sliding the freshly inked documents slowly across the polished oak table. Stoudenmire picked up the papers, his rough, calloused thumbs leaving dusty prints on the crisp parchment. He read the new regulations in complete silence, his facial muscles locked in a rigid, unforgiving scowl. He then looked up, his pale eyes piercing the highly anxious politicians seated around the room. He did not argue the legalities or offer any defense for his brutal methods. He simply tore the documents in half, dropping the shredded paper carelessly onto the floorboards. He informed the trembling aldermen that he alone controlled the streets. He dictated the necessary level of violence, and any bureaucratic attempt to interfere with his daily operations would be viewed as a direct, hostile challenge to his authority. He turned his broad back on the assembly and walked out of the room, his heavy boots echoing loudly down the empty corridor. The politicians sat in stunned, defeated silence, a profound realization settling heavily over the chamber. They had successfully ousted the ruthless criminal syndicate from power, only to replace them with a solitary, totally uncontrollable dictator. They were absolute hostages to their own municipal enforcer, trapped by the very contract they had desperately authorized. The political establishment developed an intense, consuming hatred for Stoudenmire, joining the Manning faction in their desperate, unified desire to see the towering lawman permanently removed from the settlement. This total alienation from both the criminal underworld and the legitimate political structure isolated Stoudenmire completely. He possessed no trusted allies, no dependable deputies, and absolutely no friends within the harsh, unforgiving borders of the territory. He existed solely as a blunt instrument of force, a solitary gear grinding endlessly against the hostile machinery of the town. The extreme psychological burden of maintaining perpetual combat readiness began to exact a severe, visible toll on his central nervous system. His pre-existing hypervigilance, forged in the brutal trenches of the Civil War and honed in the harsh Texas brush country, amplified into a crushing, unrelenting paranoia. He could never relax his rigid posture or lower his guard for a single second. Every shadowed alleyway presented a potential unseen ambush. Every unexpected noise on the wooden boardwalk caused his large hands to reflexively hover over his holstered weapons. The blistering August heat compounded his immense physical exhaustion. The stagnant, dry air provided absolutely no relief, constantly baking his skin and severely dehydrating his internal organs. To cope with the immense daily stress and the agonizing chronic pain radiating from the old shrapnel wound embedded deep within his torso, Stoudenmire turned increasingly toward heavy, continuous alcohol consumption. He did not drink socially or frequent the crowded bars for entertainment. He purchased completely unrefined, high-proof whiskey by the bottle, retreating to the darkest, most isolated corners of the empty saloons. He sat alone in the dim light, his broad back pressed firmly against the solid adobe walls, consuming the corrosive liquid until the sharp, jagged edges of his paranoia briefly dulled. The harsh alcohol did not bring him joy or relaxation. It merely fueled his underlying anger, making his already volatile temper exceptionally dangerous, and his physical reactions highly unpredictable. The civilian population learned to give him an even wider berth when the sharp scent of strong spirits clung to his dark wool coat. As the long months progressed into September and October 1881, the searing summer heat finally broke, replaced by cold, biting winds sweeping down from the jagged Franklin Mountains. The dropping temperatures forced the remaining population indoors, further emptying the dusty, quiet avenues. Stoudenmire's physical appearance began to noticeably and rapidly degrade. Deep, dark circles permanently bruised the thin skin beneath his pale, unblinking eyes. He lost substantial weight, his massive frame appearing slightly hollowed out by the constant lack of restorative sleep and a poor, highly irregular diet consisting primarily of dried, salted meat and cheap, burning liquor. Despite his steadily deteriorating physical condition, his lethal capacity and draw speed remained entirely undiminished. He actively sought out physical confrontations, aggressively patrolling the settlement deep into the frigid, desolate nights. In November, a desperate, shivering drifter attempted to bypass the strict weapons ban, poorly concealing a long, jagged hunting knife beneath a heavy winter blanket. Stoudenmire easily spotted the unnatural bulge near the man's waistline and rapidly intercepted him outside a closed, dark mercantile store. When the cornered drifter panicked and lunged forward, thrusting the cold steel blade toward the marshal's stomach. The response was a terrifying blur of calculated, precise violence. Stoudenmire deftly sidestepped the clumsy thrust, his left hand clamping down onto the drifter's wrist like an unforgiving iron vise. He twisted the captured limb violently outward, applying immense targeted torque to the delicate joint. The bone snapped with a loud, sickening crack, causing the man to scream in absolute agony and drop the blade onto the wooden boardwalk. Stoudenmire did not draw his firearms to execute the wounded attacker. He simply shoved the weeping, crippled man down into the frozen dirt, retrieved the confiscated knife from the boards, and continued his solitary patrol without uttering a single word. The freezing rains of late December turned the deep, wagon-rutted avenues into solid, treacherous trenches of slick ice. Stoudenmire modified his patrol gear, donning a thick, heavy canvas duster that concealed the bulk of his twin revolvers while providing essential protection against the biting winter wind. The stiff material scraped loudly against the wooden porch pillars as he walked, a slow, methodical, terrifying sound that the local residents learned to track carefully from behind their locked doors. The internal operations of the remaining businesses fully adapted to this frozen, heavily monitored reality. The few mercantile stores that barely survived the economic downturn operated on strictly limited hours, closing their heavy wooden shutters well before the pale sun disappeared behind the western peaks. Meanwhile, the local politicians frantically attempted to find obscure legal loopholes to terminate the marshal's ironclad employment contract. Mayor Schutz pored over the thick municipal charter late into the night, desperately searching for any technicality that would allow the council to forcefully dismiss Stoudenmire without inciting a massive retaliatory bloodbath. The language of the original agreement, drafted in absolute desperation during the Bloody Spring, offered zero provisions for early termination without undeniable cause. They ultimately attempted a highly cowardly bureaucratic tactic to force his voluntary resignation. The council intentionally delayed the formal authorization of his monthly salary, hoping the sudden lack of financial compensation would drive the mercenary lawman to simply pack his bags and abandon his post. Stoudenmire responded to this paper sabotage with characteristic blunt physical force. On the specific day his wages were withheld, he marched directly into the municipal bank, bypassed the long line of terrified customers, and kicked the locked wooden door of the manager's office squarely off its brass hinges. He stood silently in the doorway, his immense frame completely blocking the only exit, and calmly instructed the trembling banker to open the main iron safe and dispense the precise funds owed to him by the city. He did not draw a weapon, but the heavy, unblinking stare communicated a distinctly lethal threat. The manager frantically counted out the paper currency, his hands shaking violently as he handed the stack of bills to the lawman. Stoudenmire pocketed the money, turned on his heel and exited the building, completely bypassing the paralyzed city officials who had orchestrated the delay. December 1881 concluded with El Paso standing as a stark, terrified monument to solitary, unchecked enforcement. The chaotic, violent boomtown had been fully tamed, but the quiet peace was completely artificial, built upon a grim foundation of crushed bones, shattered skulls, and extreme public intimidation. Dallas Stoudenmire had successfully cleared the streets, but in doing so, he had united every single powerful faction in the settlement against his continued existence. The town was a highly volatile powder keg, the fuse slowly burning down as the isolated, heavy-drinking marshal continued his rigid, uncompromising occupation. February 14, 1882. A brutal, dry, cold front gripped the western Texas borderland, solidifying the deep wagon ruts of El Paso Street into treacherous ridges of hardened clay. High desert winds howled down from the jagged peaks, carrying microscopic shards of ice that sliced against exposed flesh. Dallas Stoudenmire maintained his grueling solitary enforcement, his tall frame wrapped tightly in a thick canvas duster. The physical toll of continuous patrols was compounded by a steady intake of raw, unrefined whiskey. He operated in a state of high-strung exhaustion, his central nervous system functioning solely on chemical spirits and raw adrenaline. A highly disruptive element had recently entered this volatile environment. Samuel Cummings, widely known as Doc, arrived in the settlement mere weeks prior. He was the brother-in-law of the towering enforcer, providing a rare familial connection for the profoundly isolated lawman. However, Cummings lacked the calculating discipline and terrifying physical prowess that defined Stoudenmire. The new arrival possessed a brash, confrontational demeanor, combined with a reckless arrogance fueled by the protective shadow cast by his infamous relative. He viewed the subjugated boomtown as his personal playground, underestimating the lethal, coiled tension of the suppressed criminal faction. Cummings actively antagonized the Manning syndicate. He frequented their remaining operational establishments, consuming liquor without rendering payment and loudly insulting the brothers in the presence of terrified patrons. He utilized his family tie as a protective barrier, daring the organized criminals to retaliate. The Mannings, scarred by the catastrophic losses suffered during the previous spring, initially absorbed these public humiliations in stoic silence. They clearly recognized that bringing any physical harm to Cummings would invite an overwhelming response from the municipal marshal. This fragile, strained tolerance ruptured on the afternoon of Valentine's Day. The sky hung low and gray, blocking the sun and casting a grim, pallid light over the adobe structures. Cummings confidently pushed his way through the swinging doors of the Coliseum Saloon, seeking refuge from the biting wind and demanding strong drink. The sprawling interior of the gambling hall was sparsely populated, the usual raucous crowds long since driven away by oppressive municipal regulations. Jim Manning stood behind the long mahogany bar, meticulously polishing glasses, his face hardening into a rigid mask of contained fury as the arrogant relative swaggered toward him. A tense, aggressive verbal exchange ignited swiftly. Cummings leaned heavily against the polished wood, demanding service while loudly questioning the courage and masculinity of the entire syndicate hierarchy. Jim Manning, a calculating and ruthlessly efficient operator, placed his cleaning cloth onto the counter. He spoke in a low, measured tone, demanding that the belligerent patron vacate the premises. The syndicate leader was entirely aware of the catastrophic consequences of a physical altercation, but his status within the criminal underworld required him to defend his territory against blatant public disrespect. The confrontation rapidly escalated beyond vocal insults. Cummings, emboldened by alcohol and blind arrogance, refused to retreat. He shoved a stout wooden chair aside, creating a clear space on the sawdust-covered floorboards, and aggressively challenged Manning to settle the dispute with firearms. The sheer foolishness of challenging a hardened criminal operative inside his own fortified headquarters was staggering. Jim Manning did not flinch or raise his voice. He simply nodded, his right hand moving smoothly beneath the edge of the thick mahogany bar, his fingers closing tightly around the cold wooden grip of a concealed large-caliber revolver. The physical mechanics of the ensuing violence unfolded with brutal efficiency. Cummings reached for his own sidearm, his movements clumsy and telegraphed. Jim Manning bypassed the leather holster entirely, drawing his weapon from its hidden shelf and firing a single, devastating shot directly through the thin front panel of the wooden bar. The iron projectile shattered the mahogany, sending sharp splinters flying outward before striking Cummings squarely in the center of his chest. The tremendous kinetic energy of the speeding metal sphere crushed the sternum and penetrated deeply into the vital organs. Cummings was forcefully thrown backward by the impact, his boots slipping on the sawdust. He collapsed onto his back, his unfired weapon clattering uselessly away across the floorboards. Bright crimson fluid rapidly pumped from the gaping entry wound, soaking through his thick winter coat and pooling darkly on the wooden planks. He convulsed briefly, his lungs filling with hot blood before his movement ceased, leaving him a lifeless corpse in the center of the silent gambling hall. Jim Manning stood behind the splintered bar, the smoking revolver still gripped tightly in his hand. He fully comprehended the magnitude of the catastrophic retaliation he had just guaranteed. He did not attempt to hide the body or clean the spilled blood. Instead, he instructed his remaining enforcers to barricade the saloon doors and secure the perimeter. He then swiftly exited through the rear alleyway, sprinting toward the municipal courthouse to formally surrender himself to the corrupt local judges, actively seeking the legal protection of an official arrest before the towering marshal could locate him. News of the shooting ripped rapidly through the frigid settlement. A terrified civilian messenger located Stoudenmire inside a small, dimly lit restaurant on the far side of the commercial district. The marshal was consuming a harsh cup of black coffee, attempting to ward off the biting chill, as the trembling messenger delivered the grim report of his brother-in-law's sudden demise. A profound, terrifying physical transformation overtook the imposing enforcer. The microscopic shreds of his disciplined restraint evaporated completely. Stoudenmire stood up slowly, the sheer size of his frame dominating the cramped dining room. He did not speak a single word. He kicked the small wooden table aside, sending ceramic cups shattering against the adobe wall. He stepped out onto the solidified boardwalk, the icy wind whipping the canvas of his duster. His pale eyes, usually cold and calculating, now burned with unrestrained fury. The psychological restraint that bound him to minimal societal norms was entirely severed, plunging his traumatized mind into a state of pure, homicidal vengeance. He initiated a fast, aggressive march directly toward the Colosseum. His boot heels struck the frozen mud with the rhythmic cadence of an approaching executioner. The civilian population, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere, scrambled frantically to clear his path. Men dove into narrow alleyways and merchants violently slammed their stout window shutters closed, bolting their doors against the impending violence. The entire thoroughfare emptied in mere seconds, leaving only the formidable Titan striding through the center of the desolate avenue. Reaching the facade of the gambling hall, Stoudenmire found the double doors firmly locked. He did not bother to test the brass handles. He raised his right leg and delivered a devastating kick directly to the center of the wooden barrier. The stout iron hinges groaned and violently snapped, the doors bursting inward and crashing loudly against the interior walls. He stepped over the splintered wreckage, his twin revolvers already drawn and fully cocked, ready to slaughter every living occupant within the sprawling establishment. The saloon was abandoned. The syndicate enforcers had fled out the back exits the moment they heard the loud boots approaching. Stoudenmire stood alone in the dim, smoky interior, his eyes locked onto the expanding pool of dark, congealing blood staining the sawdust near the center of the room. The visual confirmation of his relative's violent end triggered a severe, chaotic manifestation of his grief. He holstered his weapons and began systematically destroying the interior of the opulent establishment with his bare hands. He grabbed stout wooden chairs and smashed them against the expensive green faro tables, splintering the polished wood and tearing the felt. He hurled brass spittoons through the imported mirrors lining the walls, the shattering glass raining down onto the floorboards in thousands of jagged shards. He moved behind the bar, utilizing a thick wooden club to shatter every single glass bottle of expensive liquor the Mannings possessed. The sharp scent of high-proof alcohol flooded the enclosed space, mixing with the metallic odor of the spilled blood. After reducing the primary, headquarters of the criminal faction to complete rubble, he stormed back out into the freezing street. He learned from a terrified bystander that Jim Manning had surrendered to the local authorities and was currently sitting safely inside a reinforced holding cell at the municipal jail, confidently awaiting a sympathetic trial for clear self-defense. The realization that the formal justice system was actively shielding the killer pushed Stoudenmire over his psychological breaking point. The legal structures meant nothing to a man consumed by burning vengeance. The marshal initiated a terrifying, highly erratic rampage across the entire settlement. He consumed copious quantities of unrefined whiskey, marching down the icy avenues with his twin handguns drawn. He fired projectiles randomly into the air and systematically blasted the wooden signs hanging above any business remotely associated with the Manning faction. The deafening roar of his weapons echoed continuously off the flat adobe facades, the concussive blasts terrorizing the captive civilian population hiding beneath their beds. His physical degradation accelerated rapidly under the extreme stress and intense intoxication. His pale eyes became severely bloodshot. The skin around them bruised a deep, unhealthy purple. His gait, previously rigid and highly deliberate, transformed into a swaying stumble, yet he remained terrifyingly fast and lethal with his firearms. The offensive smell of stale sweat, unwashed wool, and cheap spirits radiated from his frame, repelling anyone who dared to step within his vicinity. The town was now the hostage of a grieving armed alcoholic possessing formal municipal authority. Stoudenmire aggressively accosted innocent pedestrians on the boardwalks, pressing the cold steel barrels of his revolvers against their chests and screaming demands for the precise locations of the remaining Manning brothers. He viewed every resident as a potential syndicate collaborator, his deep paranoia overriding any remaining capacity for rational thought or logical deduction. He barged into rival business establishments, utilizing his badge as a tool of total extortion. He demanded full bottles of harsh liquor without offering payment, smashing display cases and overturning thick counters if the terrified proprietors hesitated for even a fraction of a second. Nobody possessed the courage or the physical capability to stop his destructive spree. The corrupted local deputies entirely abandoned their posts, stripping off their own badges and hiding in the transient camps to avoid drawing the furious attention of the madman ruling the avenues. The municipal city council convened in an emergency guarded session, totally paralyzed by the magnitude of the chaos they had inadvertently fostered. They could not formally terminate his employment, fearing he would simply march into the chambers and slaughter the entire assembly. They could not order his arrest because there was no force on the western frontier capable of taking Dallas Stoudenmire into custody alive. The politicians sat in trembling silence, trapped by the catastrophic consequences of their own desperate decisions. The harsh winter weather intensified, evolving into a vicious sleet storm that coated the adobe structures in a slick layer of clear ice. Stoudenmire completely ignored the freezing precipitation. He continued his relentless, staggering patrols through the driving sleet, his thick canvas coat freezing solid. The severe drop in temperature failed to cool his boiling rage, his internal core temperature sustained by the massive volume of corrosive alcohol coursing through his failing digestive system. During one particularly brutal night, he cornered a known low-level associate of the criminal syndicate inside a dark, icy alleyway behind the destroyed Coliseum. The man was desperately attempting to scavenge unbroken bottles from the wreckage. Stoudenmire blocked the narrow exit, his broad silhouette illuminated briefly by flashes of lightning. He did not draw a weapon, choosing instead to utilize his superior physical strength to inflict severe, agonizing pain. He grabbed the terrified associate by the thick collar of his coat, lifting him entirely off the slick mud and slamming his back forcefully against the rigid brick wall. The marshal demanded the specific addresses of the safe houses sheltering Frank and Doc Manning. When the man stammered in genuine ignorance, Stoudenmire delivered a devastating strike to the associate's ribcage, fracturing the bone with a sharp, audible crack. The brutal interrogation continued, the enforcer systematically inflicting physical trauma in a desperate attempt to extract actionable intelligence. The battered associate provided nothing of value, possessing no knowledge of the syndicate's emergency protocols. Stoudenmire eventually dropped the bleeding, sobbing man into the freezing slush, abandoning him to the biting wind. The relentless, solitary hunt resumed, the grim enforcer stalking back out into the center of the dark, icy thoroughfare. He was a man completely hollowed out by grief and trauma, operating solely as a blunt instrument of blind, undirected destruction. The psychological state of the remaining Manning brothers deteriorated into sheer terror. They were securely locked inside fortified adobe safe houses, surrounded by their few loyal gunmen. They had successfully eliminated the annoying relative, but in doing so, they had unleashed a completely unpredictable, highly lethal adversary upon the entire settlement. They listened to the distant echoing gunshots in the night, fully realizing that their vast wealth and political connections offered zero protection against a man who no longer cared if he lived or died. Stoudenmire ceased sleeping entirely. The severe combination of profound alcohol abuse, extreme grief, and total physical exhaustion began to generate terrifying auditory and visual hallucinations. He saw moving shadows in the empty corners of his boarding house room and heard the mocking voices of the dead outlaws he had previously slaughtered whispering in the cold wind. He fired his revolvers wildly at these phantom threats, further destroying his own living quarters and terrifying the adjacent tenants into fleeing the building entirely. He obsessively stalked the outer perimeter of the settlement, actively cutting off all potential escape routes leading toward the Mexican border or the northern plains. The severe physical toll of his endless march manifested on his gear. His thick leather boots wore down at the heels, the soles flapping against the frozen dirt. His wool trousers were caked in stiff, dried mud and frozen sleet. His custom leather holsters grew deeply scarred and discolored from constant use and harsh weather exposure, but the internal mechanisms of his firearms remained meticulously oiled and fully functional. The local economy of the frontier hub completely flatlined. No commercial freight wagons entered the city limits, and no outgoing stagecoaches dared to depart. El Paso transformed into a sealed, rigid settlement, ruled by a heavily armed lawman actively patrolling the empty avenues. The civilian population huddled near their small fireplaces, rationing their dwindling food supplies and waiting desperately for the terrifying spree of the marshal's wrath to eventually exhaust itself. The bleak month concluded with Stoudenmire standing alone in the precise center of the main avenue, his thick duster caked in solid ice. He held a half-empty bottle of harsh whiskey in his left hand and a fully loaded revolver in his right. He tilted his head back, staring into the dark, swirling clouds, and yelled loud, slurred challenges into the biting winter wind, demanding the hidden killers step out into the street. He was a tragic, broken enforcer, entirely consumed by the very violence he was originally hired to suppress firmly, locked in a fatal downward spiral from which there was no possibility of return. May 29th, 1882. The transition from winter into the relentless heat of late spring turned the western Texas borderland into a baking oven. The brutal sun beat down upon the flat adobe roofs of El Paso, radiating an unyielding warmth that trapped the alkaline dust close to the ground. The settlement operated under an oppressive dread, paralyzed by the deterioration of its primary enforcer. Dallas Stoudenmire remained locked in a self-destructive spiral of heavy alcohol consumption and violent grief, following the loss of his brother-in-law. His physical presence no longer represented municipal order. It had degraded into an unmanaged threat to every living soul residing within the city limits. The booming commercial expansion defining the previous year was completely stalled. The continuous terrifying sound of random gunshots ringing out from the marshal's heavy sidearms during all hours of the night kept prospective investors and transient laborers far away from local businesses. Commercial rail lines actively discouraged their workers from disembarking near the hostile zone. The once crowded boardwalk sat vacant, the thick wooden planks baking silently in the noon sun. Legitimate merchants found their shelves fully stocked, but their ledgers empty, their livelihoods actively strangled by the terrifying reality of an armed, intoxicated giant claiming absolute ownership of the avenues. The profound physical toll of severe chronic alcoholism ravaged Stoudenmire's imposing frame. He rarely consumed solid sustenance, relying almost exclusively on potent, unrefined whiskey to fuel his daily movements and numb the chronic pain radiating from his old combat injuries. His skin took on an unhealthy, sallow pallor, starkly contrasting with the bruised, dark tissue surrounding his unblinking, pale eyes. His custom leather holsters, once meticulously maintained, now hung slightly askew on his thinning waist. The wooden grips of his twin revolvers stained, with dried sweat and desert grime. Despite this visible decay, his underlying lethality remained intact, making him a profoundly unpredictable entity wandering the dirt thoroughfares. The municipal city council, led by Mayor Solomon Schutz, reached a critical breaking point regarding this escalating crisis. The wealthy aldermen gathered in secrecy, utilizing guarded private residences rather than the official town hall to conduct their desperate meetings. They fully comprehended that their chosen instrument of enforcement had mutated into a catastrophic, unmanageable liability. The settlement was bleeding out economically, and the politicians recognized that failure to act would result in the financial collapse of their community. They needed to sever the employment contract they had so eagerly drafted, but executing this maneuver carried an exceptionally high risk of provoking a homicidal response from the paranoid lawman. The politicians faced a severe logistical nightmare trying to implement this termination. They possessed no secondary law enforcement mechanism capable of arresting or forcefully subduing Stoudenmire. The local deputies had long since abandoned their official posts, terrified of drawing the furious attention of the rogue marshal. Hiring external mercenaries to assassinate him proved impossible. The terrifying reputation of the towering enforcer was well known throughout the Western Territories, and no rational gunman was willing to initiate a close-quarters gun battle against an adversary possessing such unparalleled draw speed and accuracy. The council had to rely on careful political maneuvering and the faint hope that the marshal retained a shred of rational comprehension beneath his intoxicated exterior. A complicating factor restricted the council's available options during these secret discussions. The alderman could terminate his municipal appointment and demand the surrender of the Silvertown Star, but stripping the badge would not disarm the man stalking their streets. In mid-1882, after resigning, Stoudenmire accepted a position as a United States Deputy Marshal, a federal commission carrying authority far beyond the city limits. Despite this glaring vulnerability in their plan, the desperate politicians decided they had to proceed with the firing. They meticulously drafted formal documents of termination, their hands shaking visibly as they inked the thick parchment. The legal language was stark and uncompromising, demanding the surrender of the 5-pointed silver municipal star and the cessation of his local duties. The alderman understood that presenting these documents required a face-to-face confrontation, a prospect that deeply terrified every single man sitting around the mahogany table. They scheduled the highly volatile meeting for the late afternoon of May 29th, hoping the bright daylight would somehow mitigate the potential for extreme, spontaneous violence. A trembling clerk was dispatched to locate the intoxicated lawman and deliver the formal written summons. The clerk found Stoudenmire seated alone in the dark corner of an empty dining establishment, a half-empty bottle of harsh spirits resting on the wooden table before him. The towering enforcer read the legal summons in complete silence, his bloodshot eyes scanning the elegant handwriting without betraying any emotion. He did not physically assault the terrified messenger, merely offering a cold glare before slowly rising from his splintered wooden chair. He adjusted the heavy leather gun belt riding on his hips, ensuring the twin handguns were fully loaded and accessible, before stepping out into the blinding afternoon sun. The subsequent walk toward the municipal building felt entirely different from his celebrated arrival the previous spring. Then, he was the highly sought-after savior, the brutal instrument explicitly hired to cleanse the corrupted streets of syndicate control. Now he was the isolated, hated target of the very administration that had previously empowered him. He marched straight down the center of the rutted dirt avenue, his stiff-legged gait kicking up small clouds of fine alkaline dust. The civilian population watched his approach through small cracks in their heavy window shutters, sensing the impending collision between the rogue enforcer and the desperate political establishment attempting to strip him of his local power. Inside the town hall, the atmosphere was dense with raw fear. Mayor Schutz and the aldermen sat rigidly behind the main council table, their faces slick with nervous perspiration. They had wisely ordered the few remaining city employees to vacate the building entirely, minimizing the potential civilian casualties if a gun battle suddenly erupted within the confined space. The heavy wooden double doors located at the far end of the corridor remained closed, functioning as the only physical barrier between the terrified politicians and the highly lethal armed man they were actively attempting to fire from his position. The loud, rhythmic sound of Stoudenmire's boots echoed menacingly on the wooden planks outside the chamber. The front doors swung open forcefully, and the massive figure completely filled the frame. He did not remove his wide-brimmed hat, nor did he offer any polite greeting to his employers. He walked deliberately into the center of the chamber, his broad shoulders dominating the cramped, stuffy room. The sharp, offensive odor of stale sweat, unwashed clothing, and raw, high-proof whiskey radiated heavily from his canvas duster, forcing the delicate politicians to physically recoil in their wooden chairs as he approached the table. Stoudenmire stopped a few feet from the council table, planting his thick boots shoulder-width apart in an aggressive, combative stance. His large hands rested lightly near his waistline, his long fingers hovering mere millimeters away from the polished wooden grips of his custom revolvers. His pale, bloodshot eyes locked onto the trembling mayor, silently demanding an explanation for the unwanted interruption of his daily drinking routine. The oppressive silence stretched for several agonizing seconds, the tension vibrating intensely within the enclosed, stuffy air of the municipal chambers as the politicians struggled to find their collective voice. Mayor Schutz eventually cleared his dry throat, his voice cracking slightly as he initiated the dangerous dialogue. He wisely did not raise his voice or attempt to project an aura of false, commanding authority. He spoke in a low, extremely cautious tone, outlining the severe economic devastation currently plaguing the frontier settlement. He explicitly detailed the complete collapse of commercial trade and the deep, pervasive terror gripping the civilian population. He carefully avoided directly insulting the lawman's erratic behavior or heavy drinking, framing the termination as a necessary, bureaucratic shift rather than a personal condemnation of his violent methods. The towering enforcer listened to the political speech in absolute, unyielding silence. His facial muscles remained entirely rigid, betraying no internal emotion or cognitive processing. He clearly recognized the sheer hypocrisy of the wealthy men sitting safely before him. They had eagerly demanded a monster to slaughter the entrenched criminal syndicate, completely ignoring the inevitable, brutal consequences of making that request. Now that the dirty, lethal work was finished, they sought to easily discard the very instrument that had secured their survival. The burning anger within his chest flared violently, mixing dangerously with the massive quantity of alcohol saturating his bloodstream. Mayor Schutz nervously pushed the formal termination document across the polished oak table, the thick paper sliding to a halt near the edge. He softly requested the return of the municipal badge, stating that the city no longer required the expensive services of a dedicated town marshal. The aldermen held their collective breath, their hands gripping the armrests of their chairs tightly. They fully expected Stoudenmire to draw his heavy weapons and slaughter the entire assembly in a chaotic blur of black powder smoke and high-velocity projectiles. They were securely trapped in a tiny room with a heavily armed apex predator. The critical moment hung suspended in the hot, stagnant air of the chamber. Stoudenmire stared down at the written document, reading the final demands, then slowly raised his gaze to meet the terrified eyes of the politicians. His right hand moved slowly upward, purposefully traveling away from the lethal hardware resting on his hip. He reached toward the thick wool of his dark vest, his long fingers grasping the 5-pointed silver star pinned firmly near his chest. He forcefully yanked the metal badge downward, tearing the fabric of his garment in the process as the pin ripped free. He threw the stamped piece of silver violently onto the wooden table. The heavy metal clattered loudly, sliding across the polished surface and striking the inkwell with a sharp clink. He did not reach for the termination papers or offer any written signature of acceptance. He leaned forward slightly, resting his massive knuckles on the edge of the table, his bloodshot eyes narrowing into a cold, intensely predatory glare. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, the harsh sound vibrating with an undeniable, deeply lethal threat that cut through the nervous tension of the room like a physical blade. He explicitly reminded the trembling council that while they possessed the authority to reclaim their cheap piece of tin, they held absolutely zero jurisdiction over his physical presence in the territory. He coldly informed them that he retained his federal commission as a deputy United States Marshal, and he firmly intended to remain within the borders of El Paso. He promised the politicians that any attempt to forcibly remove him from the settlement, or any aggressive action taken by the remaining criminal factions, would be met with an overwhelming, catastrophic deployment of lethal force against any and all attackers. Stoudenmire slowly pushed himself away from the table, turning his broad back entirely on the paralyzed assembly. He walked back down the center aisle, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the floorboards of the empty building. He pushed through the swinging wooden doors and exited the municipal structure, stepping back out into the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. The aldermen remained frozen in their chairs long after the sound of his footsteps had faded completely into the dusty avenue, unable to process the sheer intensity of the terrifying confrontation they had just barely survived. A profound wave of relief washed over the council room once his departure was confirmed. They had successfully executed the bureaucratic termination, without sustaining any physical casualties. The formal contract was severed, and the city was officially no longer responsible for the erratic, violent actions of the towering gunman. However, the deep underlying dread quickly returned. They realized they had achieved a hollow, purely paper victory. They had successfully removed his official title, but the highly dangerous, heavily intoxicated giant remained fully armed and actively roaming their dirt streets without any formal oversight. The political maneuver effectively stripped Stoudenmire of his daily mandate to patrol the commercial district or enforce municipal ordinances. He was no longer required to intercept arriving stagecoaches, confiscate civilian firearms, or clear the transient camps of vagrants. He was an independent federal agent without a specific local assignment, operating entirely on his own flawed, highly paranoid volition. This absolute lack of structured responsibility severely accelerated his rapid descent into total unmanaged alcoholism and erratic behavior, leaving him without a daily routine to anchor his deeply fractured, traumatized mind. He transitioned seamlessly from an occupying, highly aggressive lawman to a heavily armed, entirely unpredictable menace wandering the border town. He continued to frequent the local saloons, demanding strong liquor and outright refusing to offer payment. Proprietors complied instantly, terrified of the heavy twin revolvers resting securely on his hips. He spent his days sitting in the dark corners of these establishments, consuming raw spirits and aggressively staring down anyone who dared to enter the room. His complete isolation was absolute, possessing no friends, no allies, and no structured purpose beyond basic survival and heavy drinking. The remaining members of the Manning syndicate, closely monitoring the political developments from their secure locations, swiftly learned of the highly publicized resignation. The news generated a massive surge of dark, calculating anticipation within the criminal underworld. The brothers understood that the towering enforcer was no longer shielded by the formal legal apparatus of the municipal government. If they managed to eliminate him now, they would not be executing the chief of police. They would merely be killing a highly volatile, drunken federal deputy involved in a localized feud, a far less problematic crime to defend in court. This crucial legal distinction entirely shifted the tactical landscape of the settlement. The Mannings began slowly extending their illicit operations outward, actively testing the boundaries of the newly established power vacuum. Their loyal gunmen returned to the outer fringes of the commercial district, their hands resting close to their concealed weapons. They actively avoided crossing paths with Stoudenmire, continuing to deeply fear his unparalleled draw speed and raw kinetic capability. But they began carefully laying the groundwork for a highly coordinated future strike to completely reclaim their lost territory from the lone enforcer. Stoudenmire, highly attuned to the subtle shifts in the frontier environment, instantly recognized the syndicate's cautious resurgence. His deep paranoia flared violently, fueled by the massive quantities of alcohol damaging his cognitive functions. He began actively hunting the Manning operatives, aggressively stalking the dark alleyways and narrow corridors situated behind the main avenues. He openly taunted the hidden gunmen, yelling slurred, profane challenges into the hot, stagnant night air, demanding they step out of the shadows and face him in the center of the street in a fair, open contest of speed and accuracy. The settlement plunged back into a state of severe, high-alert terror. The temporary artificial peace previously enforced by the municipal badge shattered entirely, replaced by the grim reality of a deeply personal, heavily armed blood feud operating completely outside the bounds of local law. The civilian population barricaded their sturdy doors and thick window shutters every evening, fully expecting to hear the sudden, deafening roar of heavy-caliber crossfire erupting right outside their adobe walls. The town was firmly trapped between a resurgent, organized criminal faction and a massive, erratic lone wolf actively seeking a final confrontation. The lack of formal municipal duties afforded Stoudenmire ample time to obsess heavily over his deep-seated grievances. He harbored a burning, unquenchable hatred for Jim Manning, the calculating architect directly responsible for the brutal slaughter of his relative during the winter. This single-minded focus on vengeance consumed his remaining rational thought processes. He did not seek to formally arrest the syndicate leader. He fully intended to execute him in broad daylight, utilizing the sheer, overwhelming firepower strapped to his waist to settle the score once and for all. His physical deterioration continued completely unchecked throughout the blazing summer months. The intense heat combined with the severe dehydration caused by chronic alcohol abuse left him prone to sudden, violent tremors and intense, agonizing stomach cramps. He frequently slept in the dirty, sawdust-covered corners of the saloons, his heavy hands gripping the polished wooden handles of his revolvers even while unconscious to prevent any cowardly ambushes. He was a broken, deeply traumatized survivor of total war, wholly consumed by the very violence he had mastered, slowly rotting away from the inside out. The local political establishment entirely abandoned any further attempts to intervene or control the escalating situation. The mayor and the wealthy aldermen securely barricaded themselves inside their expensive residences, fully resigning their authority to the impending catastrophic collision rapidly approaching the center of their settlement. They had completely lost control of the beast they had eagerly summoned, and they could only wait for the final, bloody resolution to play out in the deep dust of the main avenue, hoping they would survive the chaotic aftermath of the inevitable shootout. As May gave way to the unrelenting, scorching heat of June, Dallas Stoudenmire stood as a tragic, highly lethal anomaly on the western frontier. Stripped of his local badge, alienated from every facet of the surrounding society, and deeply poisoned by unrefined spirits, he roamed the dirt streets entirely alone. He was a walking, heavily armed powder keg, his pale eyes constantly scanning the dark, shifting shadows, aggressively waiting for the precise moment the entrenched syndicate finally gathered the courage to initiate the ultimate, definitive gun battle for total control of the borderlands. July 1882 initiated a punishing season across the western Texas basin. The Chihuahuan desert offered zero respite, baking El Paso's mud bricks into brittle clay. Relentless solar radiation dominated the daily cycle, turning stagnant wind into a burning weight pressing down upon the commercial district. The thoroughfare's alkaline dirt degraded into abrasive powder, drifting lazily on dry thermal currents before settling over the empty boardwalks. This harsh climate perfectly mirrored the destructive friction building between the isolated former lawmen and the resurgent criminal syndicate waiting silently in the dark alleys. Without the rigid structure of municipal duties dictating his schedule, Dallas Stoudenmire drifted into a chaotic, unmoored existence. The mornings previously dedicated to inspecting the stagecoach lines and assessing transient camps dissolved into formless hours spent securing strong liquor. The absence of official obligations stripped away the final layer of societal purpose grounding his traumatized mind. Wandering the sun-bleached planks without a clear destination or a defined objective, he operated on pure instinct and festering resentment, a solitary ghost haunting his own territory. Physical decay accelerated at a frightening pace under the combined assault of the summer sun and copious volumes of unrefined whiskey. The once imposing musculature began to rapidly wither from malnutrition, leaving dark clothing hanging loosely on his broad shoulders. Bruised, purplish tissue permanently stained the delicate skin beneath his unblinking eyes. Hands capable of drawing revolvers with blinding speed now suffered from persistent physiological tremors during rare periods of sobriety. Managing the agonizing pain from old combat wounds required constant chemical sedation just to function. Despite his termination from the local force, he prominently displayed his federal credentials. The silver star of a Deputy United States Marshal remained pinned to his dark vest, a physical reminder to the civilian population that sweeping authority still resided within his grasp. He weaponized this elevated legal status, utilizing the badge to demand free alcohol from terrified saloon owners and to secure undisturbed corners in public dining halls. The commission shielded him from trivial complaints local politicians might attempt to file, granting a terrifying level of autonomy. Jim Manning altered his long-term strategic approach, observing this erratic behavior from the secure confines of his fortified properties. The syndicate leader recognized his adversary was slowly destroying himself, but the process was agonizingly slow and incredibly dangerous for their business operations. He ordered loyal foot soldiers to maintain a strict distance from the volatile federal agent. The organization understood that provoking a spontaneous gun battle in the open street carried unacceptable risks. They needed a controlled environment to eliminate the threat, requiring immense calculating patience. Frank Manning assumed the primary responsibility for gathering actionable intelligence on the ex-marshal. This continuous covert surveillance operation utilized a network of paid informants ranging from bartenders to frightened merchants, tracking Stoudenmire's daily movements. The syndicate meticulously mapped his preferred drinking establishments, varying patrol routes, and shifting sleep patterns. They cataloged moments of deep intoxication alongside brief periods of lucid aggression. Their goal aimed to identify a fatal vulnerability, a predictable pattern they could eventually exploit to orchestrate an inescapable, flawless assassination. Stoudenmire actively engaged in a psychological war of attrition against his unseen watchers. He frequently altered his daily path to intentionally pass by remaining businesses owned by the criminal faction, pausing his dragging stride directly in front of the Colosseum. He turned his broad shoulders to face the barricaded wooden doors. He stood silently in the blinding glare, thumbs resting near the polished grips of his handguns, staring intently at the second-story windows. By forcefully projecting his willingness to engage in total violence, he dared them to strike. During the sweltering, unforgiving middle of July, the simmering tension spilled over into a brutal physical altercation. Stoudenmire entered a neutral gambling hall located on the edge of the commercial district, his duster caked in pale dust. He demanded a bottle of rye whiskey from the trembling bartender. A foolish, highly intoxicated laborer, unaware of the giant's identity, made a derogatory comment regarding the smell of stale alcohol and unwashed wool radiating from the former municipal enforcer. Stoudenmire did not draw his sidearms to address the insult. He pivoted sharply, his right hand shooting forward with devastating force. Grabbing the laborer by the front of his canvas shirt, he lifted the man's boots completely off the floorboards. With a single vicious motion, he hurled the antagonist across the room. The victim crashed violently into a stout wooden poker table, splintering the legs and scattering clay chips across the sawdust. The terrified room plunged into absolute stunned silence. The laborer, acting on pure drunken instinct, scrambled to his feet and lunged forward with clenched fists. Stoudenmire stepped inside the wild swing, driving his knee upward into the man's unprotected abdomen. The severe impact ruptured internal tissue, dropping the attacker instantly to the floor. The furious enforcer followed up with a downward strike, his boot heel connecting solidly with the man's ribcage. The sound of snapping bone echoed clearly through the silent hall. Stoudenmire retrieved his bottle and exited, leaving the bleeding victim crumpled among ruined furniture. News of the savage beating circulated rapidly through the terrified community. The frightened civilian population completely withdrew from public spaces during his waking hours. Merchants locked their front doors the second they spotted his dark silhouette moving down the avenue. The settlement transformed into a ghost town by mid-afternoon, the streets devoid of human traffic, abandoned to stray dogs and the howling desert wind. Stoudenmire owned the thoroughfares, but his kingdom consisted entirely of locked doors, drawn curtains, and the pervasive scent of fear. The relentless summer climate exacerbated the crushing tension. Dust storms swept frequently through the basin, turning the sky a bruised purple and coating adobe structures in thick layers of gritty sand. The abrasive wind stripped paint from wooden signs and piled deep drifts of dirt against saloon doors. Stoudenmire wandered through these blinding storms, the canvas of his duster whipping violently around his legs. Reduced visual clarity only heightened his severe paranoia, forcing his hands to hover constantly over his holstered weapons. His mental state continued to fracture under the immense strain of total isolation and heavy chemical dependency. Vivid auditory hallucinations plagued his waking hours, bringing the whispering voices of dead men from the dark alleyways. He frequently stopped in the center of the empty street, drawing his revolvers and yelling slurred, furious threats at the empty air, challenging invisible assassins to step into the light. His chest heaved as he scanned quiet rooftops for non-existent snipers. His tenuous grip on reality was slowly eroding, replaced by combat-induced psychosis. Jim Manning maintained a strict iron grip on his frustrated enforcers. The syndicate gunmen, eager to reclaim their lost territory and avenge fallen comrades, demanded permission to ambush the erratic federal agent. Manning ruthlessly denied these requests. He understood that a failed assassination attempt would trigger an indiscriminate rampage capable of destroying their entire criminal enterprise. He insisted on absolute strategic patience, forcing his men to watch from the shadows as the towering gunman slowly poisoned himself, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. This strictly mandated patience generated severe financial strain on the criminal organization. The continued absence of the vice trade drained their cash reserves rapidly. They could not resume their highly profitable gambling operations or their illicit prostitution networks while the armed madman continued to terrorize the commercial district. The Mannings were losing massive sums of money every single day the standoff dragged on. Economic reality dictated that a final resolution was absolutely necessary, regardless of the immense physical risks involved in confronting the former city marshal. By late July, erratic public displays of raw force escalated into random acts of destruction. Stoudenmire utilized the wooden signs of closed businesses for target practice, standing in the middle of the avenue and firing metallic projectiles into the painted lettering. The deafening roar of his large-caliber weapons shattered the afternoon silence, sending large splinters of wood flying into the alkaline dust. He demonstrated his terrifying marksmanship to the hidden watchers, proving that despite intense intoxication, his hand-eye coordination and lethal accuracy remained completely unimpaired. While his biological systems failed drastically, he maintained the mechanical perfection of his primary tools. He spent hours sitting in the dark, meticulously disassembling his twin Smith & Wesson revolvers. He cleaned the grooved bores, oiled internal springs, and polished the thick brass cartridges. Ensuring the heavy hammers fell with crisp, flawless precision became a daily ritual. He trusted the cold steel far more than he trusted his own failing body. The firearms were the sole anchor connecting him to the physical world, the only instruments keeping him alive. August arrived bringing the absolute climax of unforgiving seasonal heat. Intense solar radiation baked the mud brick structures until they cracked, and scarce water sources in the region began to dry up completely. Livestock perished in surrounding fields, their swollen carcasses attracting thick clouds of black flies. The oppressive warmth trapped the odor of stale beer and equine manure within the tight confines of the settlement. Stoudenmire sweat profusely beneath his thick clothing, his body struggling desperately to regulate its internal temperature while processing volumes of raw alcohol. Driven by a burning, restless need for a definitive confrontation, he actively sought a specific target. During a scorching afternoon, he intercepted a known low-level associate of the Manning faction walking quickly down the wooden boardwalk. Stoudenmire blocked the path, his huge frame casting a long shadow over the terrified man. He did not draw his sidearms. He simply stared down with bloodshot, pale eyes, exuding an aura of pure, unadulterated menace. The associate froze, his hands trembling violently as he awaited a sudden, fatal gunshot. Stoudenmire utilized sheer, crushing physical intimidation to deliver a specific message. Leaning forward, the sharp scent of whiskey rolling off his breath, he instructed the shaking associate to relay a direct challenge to his employers. He named Jim and Frank Manning explicitly, demanding they cease hiding behind their locked doors and face him in a final open contest of speed and accuracy. He did not raise his voice. The low, gravelly tone carried the weight of absolute certainty. He shoved the man aside, allowing him to flee. The trembling, terrified associate delivered the harsh ultimatum to the syndicate leaders hiding within their fortified safe house. The message confirmed their deepest fears. The erratic federal agent was actively forcing an endgame. The brotherly hierarchy convened a desperate strategy session. They recognized that the current situation was entirely unsustainable. The town was dead, their finances were crippled, and the towering gunman was openly challenging their authority and courage. A definitive response was required to salvage their criminal empire and bruised reputations. The treacherous concept of a deceptive peace treaty began formulating within the syndicate's tactical planning. A direct shootout in the open street remained a highly flawed, dangerous strategy. They required a method to lure Stoudenmire into a confined space, an environment where his superior draw speed could be mitigated by multiple angles of attack and solid physical cover. They decided to manipulate his desire for a final resolution, crafting a trap disguised as a formal negotiation to permanently settle their bitter, bloody feud. The cowardly local politicians remained entirely invisible during this critical escalation. Mayor Schutz and the wealthy aldermen observed the unfolding crisis from the safety of their guarded homes, completely abdicating their civic responsibilities. They offered no mediation, dispatched no messengers, and made absolutely no attempt to request intervention from state authorities. They were content to let the criminal underworld and the rogue federal deputy annihilate one another, coldly calculating that whoever survived the impending slaughter would be severely weakened and easier to manage in the aftermath. By mid-August, Stoudenmire's meager dietary intake reduced to merely strong liquor and sporadic bites of tough dried meat. His digestive system rejected solid food, causing severe, crippling cramps that forced him to double over in silent agony. He spent increasingly longer periods confined to his dark boarding house room, lying on the hard mattress and staring blankly at the stained ceiling. His physical deterioration was approaching a critical, fatal threshold. His body was actively consuming itself, fueled solely by raw vengeance and chemical dependency. The grim physical manifestation of failing internal organs became impossible to hide. A sickly yellow jaundice began to tint the whites of his eyes and the pale skin of his face, indicating severe liver distress. He moved with a stiff, agonizing slowness during his morning patrols, his joints aching fiercely. Yet the moment he stepped onto the public avenues, he forced his massive frame into a rigid, imposing posture, refusing to display any weakness to the hidden enemies tracking his every move. The calendar slowly turned toward the approaching month of September. The brutal intensity of the summer heat began to subtly shift, the nights growing marginally cooler as the desert winds changed direction. This slight drop in atmospheric pressure signaled the end of the stagnant, paralyzed season. The syndicate finalized the complex logistics of their planned ambush, selecting a specific, highly controlled location for the proposed meeting. They needed an environment they owned entirely, a space pre-sited for overlapping fields of fire. The Mannings initiated their highly deceptive overtures during the first week of the new month. They utilized a neutral, terrified civilian messenger to deliver a carefully worded proposal to the ex-marshal. The message suggested a formal, unarmed parley to negotiate a permanent cessation of hostilities. They offered to divide the territorial control of the settlement, proposing a truce that would allow both factions to operate without the constant threat of sudden death. The proposal was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, playing directly upon the exhaustion gripping the border town. Stoudenmire received the tense verbal proposal while sitting in his usual dark corner of the empty dining hall. His reaction was a mixture of deep, ingrained suspicion and a burning desire for a violent resolution. He recognized the high probability of a coordinated trap. He knew the syndicate leaders lacked the basic honor required to uphold a negotiated peace treaty. However, the prospect of finally confronting his enemies face to face, of dragging them out of their fortified shadows, proved far too intoxicating to ignore. He formally accepted the basic premise of the meeting, sending the trembling messenger back with a single affirmative nod. He did not agree to the stipulation regarding disarmament. He had no intention of walking into a hostile environment without his twin sidearms. He spent the entire night methodically cleaning his weapons, loading fresh, heavy cartridges into the polished cylinders. He prepared himself mentally for a catastrophic close-quarters gun battle, fully embracing the high probability that he might not survive the impending encounter. The early days of September 1882 set the final stage for the fatal collision. The isolated, deeply poisoned enforcer stepped out into the dusty avenue, his heavy canvas coat brushing against the wooden boardwalk. He walked slowly toward the designated meeting location, his pale, jaundiced eyes locked forward, his large hands resting securely on the grips of his revolvers. The entire settlement held its collective breath, watching from behind locked shutters as the towering titan marched deliberately into the jaws of the waiting syndicate. September 18th, 1882. The morning sun crested the jagged eastern ridges, throwing sharp, elongated shadows across the dusty avenues of the border settlement. The relentless summer heat had marginally fractured, replaced by a dry, biting wind, carrying the metallic scent of impending violence. Dallas Stoudenmire rose from his sparse boarding house mattress, fully aware the approaching hours held the climax of his bitter, localized war. He ignored the gnawing ache in his failing liver, relying on pure adrenaline to stabilize his trembling hands. Today required absolute lethal precision, devoid of the chemical haze clouding his recent existence. He approached a small wash basin, splashing chilled alkaline water over his jaundiced face. The shocking temperature narrowed his focus, sharpening the dull edges of his traumatized mind. He consciously bypassed his usual morning ration of harsh whiskey. Instead, he meticulously inspected his twin large-caliber Smith & Wesson revolvers. Unlatching the cylinders, he checked the brass cartridges to ensure the percussion primers were completely free of moisture or defect. Snapping the mechanism shut produced a crisp, metallic clack, the sound echoing within the confined Spartan room. He secured the weapons into their worn, custom-fitted leather holsters, testing the draw friction to guarantee a flawless, unimpeded release. Donning his stout canvas duster, he allowed the thick fabric to obscure the lethal hardware resting on his hips. Stepping out onto the wooden boardwalk, his boots struck the planks with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The settlement remained unnaturally quiet. The civilian population, highly attuned to the shifting dynamics of the booming hub, sensed the escalating danger and remained firmly locked inside their adobe dwellings. Stoudenmire walked toward the Manning Brothers Saloon, the designated venue for the supposed peace treaty. He fully understood the high probability of walking into a coordinated fatal trap, yet his pride and raw aggression propelled him forward. Inside the targeted establishment, the atmosphere was dense with calculating anticipation. Jim and Doc Manning stood near the polished mahogany bar, verifying the readiness of their own concealed weaponry. They had orchestrated this meeting under the strict guise of a formal truce, proposing to divide the municipal territory and end the costly feud. However, the true objective remained the total permanent elimination of the former city marshal. The brothers had cleared the gambling hall of all patrons, leaving only a few highly trusted armed syndicate operatives positioned strategically in the deep shadows near the rear exits. The interior layout heavily favored the defending faction. Stout timber columns supported the high ceiling, providing excellent bullet-resistant cover for the hidden gunman. A large, green felt billiard table dominated the center of the floorboards, creating a substantial, physical obstacle restricting forward momentum. Jim Manning positioned himself slightly behind his brother, his hand resting casually near a hidden shelf containing a loaded sidearm. Doc Manning stood closer to the entrance, designated as the primary conversationalist tasked with engaging the towering enforcer upon his arrival. The swinging wooden doors creaked open, admitting a harsh shaft of morning sunlight into the dim, smoke-stained interior. Stoudenmire stepped across the threshold, his immense frame blocking the glare. Pausing momentarily, his eyes rapidly adjusted to the shifting light, scanning the room for concealed threats. He noted the physical placement of the siblings and the total absence of neutral bystanders. The lethal architecture of the ambush was blatantly obvious to his deeply experienced tactical mind. Advancing slowly past the billiard table, he stopped mere feet away from Doc, keeping his broad back safely away from the main entrance. The initial dialogue commenced in low, highly tense tones. Doc offered a false smile, gesturing toward the bar and suggesting a drink to seal the newly proposed accord. Stoudenmire flatly refused the offer, his voice a dry, gravelly rasp. He demanded they finalize the verbal agreement without the pretense of frontier hospitality. The sheer proximity of the bitter rivals generated a crushing, dense pressure within the room. Every microscopic movement, every shifting of weight was hyper-analyzed by men permanently conditioned to react to sudden, violent intent. Shifting the conversation, Doc brought up the specific underlying grievances fueling the feud. He highlighted the numerous public insults and the brutal physical beatings Stoudenmire had inflicted upon syndicate associates over the past weeks. The discussion rapidly lost its diplomatic veneer, devolving into a sequence of sharp, aggressive accusations. Stoudenmire stood his ground, his hands resting lightly near his waistline, refusing to concede any territorial dominance. The verbal exchange escalated in volume, the harsh words bouncing off the flat timber walls of the enclosed gambling hall. The critical breaking point arrived when the topic of mutual lies and targeted slander surfaced. Stoudenmire bluntly accused the siblings of organizing the cowardly failed shotgun assassination attempt during the spring. Doc vehemently denied the charge, his face flushing dark red with sudden anger. Pointing a thick finger toward the towering enforcer, he shouted that someone in the room was a damn liar. This specific, highly volatile phrase functioned as the absolute, undeniable catalyst for the impending kinetic explosion. In the brutal culture of the western border, calling an armed man a liar demanded a lethal physical response. The transition from tense negotiation to full combat occurred in a blinding fraction of a second. Both men possessed terrifying reflexes honed by years of surviving the hostile territory. Doc's hand dropped violently toward his right hip, his fingers closing around the wooden grip of his revolver. He drew the weapon upward, clearing the leather holster with practiced, fluid speed. Stoudenmire, anticipating the aggressive movement, executed his own synchronized draw, his large hands retrieving the twin sidearms with terrifying mechanical precision. Doc fired the first shot. His weapon roared, expelling a dense, expanding cloud of white sulfuric smoke. The high-velocity metallic projectile screamed across the short distance, striking Stoudenmire directly in the left arm. The kinetic force of the impact jolted the immense enforcer backward, his boots sliding against the sawdust-covered floorboards. Doc fired again. The second round struck Stoudenmire in the center of his chest, but the lethal sphere did not penetrate his vital organs. The projectile impacted a thick, tightly folded stack of parchment papers tucked securely inside the inner pocket of his canvas duster. The dense paper absorbed the majority of the brutal energy, deflecting the deformed metal fragment away from his heart. Stoudenmire absorbed the massive physical shock without collapsing. Recovering his balance swiftly, he raised his right revolver and squeezed the trigger. His weapon detonated, sending a solid sphere tearing through the acrid powder smoke. The projectile found its mark, striking Doc squarely in the right forearm. The violent impact shattered the radius bone and completely severed the surrounding muscle tissue, destroying the syndicate leader's ability to grip his firearm. Crying out in agonizing pain, Doc's hand flew open involuntarily. His revolver slipped from his ruined fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden planks. He clutched his bleeding, useless limb, entirely defenseless and exposed to the towering giant standing before him. Stoudenmire, ignoring the deep, bruising ache in his own chest, lunged forward with terrifying speed. He did not fire a second round to execute his crippled adversary. Instead, he utilized his immense physical strength, initiating a brutal close-quarters grapple. Grabbing the wounded syndicate leader by the thick fabric of his coat, Stoudenmire physically lifted him off the floorboards. He utilized the smaller man as a human shield against the other operatives hidden within the room. Jim Manning, witnessing the rapid, disastrous turn of events, drew his own concealed sidearm from behind the mahogany bar. Raising the iron barrel, he desperately attempted to acquire a clear line of sight on the former marshal, but Stoudenmire kept Doc firmly positioned between them, continuously shifting his angle to block the impending shot. The physical struggle was desperate and highly chaotic. Stoudenmire shoved Doc forcefully backward, driving him toward the front entrance of the saloon. He aimed to drag the conflict out into the open street, away from the confined, compromised interior where he was heavily outnumbered. The two men crashed violently through the swinging wooden doors, shattering the slats and spilling out onto the sun-baked boardwalk. Bright, blinding daylight washed over them as they grappled fiercely in the alkaline dust, their boots kicking up thick clouds of dry dirt. Doc fought with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a cornered animal, kicking and scratching at the giant holding him captive. Stoudenmire maintained his iron grip, his left hand locking around Doc's throat while his right hand kept his drawn revolver pointed toward the shattered saloon doors. He knew Jim would follow, and he actively prepared to engage the remaining brother the second he stepped across the threshold. The street remained entirely devoid of civilian witnesses, the population hiding terrified behind their locked adobe walls as the deafening gunfire echoed through the settlement. Inside the establishment, Jim vaulted over the polished wooden bar, his weapon raised and fully cocked. Sprinting toward the bright opening, his face twisted in a mask of calculated fury. He stepped out onto the elevated boardwalk, his eyes rapidly scanning the chaotic struggle occurring in the dirt below. Witnessing Stoudenmire overpowering his sibling, the massive enforcer preparing to deliver a final lethal blow to the crippled syndicate leader, Jim understood he possessed only a microsecond to alter the trajectory of the brutal confrontation. Sensing the movement above him, Stoudenmire forcefully shoved Doc away, sending the wounded man tumbling into the deep wagon ruts. Pivoting sharply, he raised his right revolver to align the iron sights on the figure standing on the porch. Pulling the hammer backward, he locked the internal sear, tracking the target with lethal precision. But Jim already possessed the superior angle and the established firing position. The syndicate leader aimed his handgun downward, centering the barrel on the towering lawman's head. Squeezing the trigger, the weapon roared, expelling a bright tongue of orange fire and a thick cloud of acrid smoke. The high-velocity metallic projectile traveled downward on a steep trajectory, completely bypassing Stoudenmire's thick canvas coat. The solid sphere struck the massive enforcer precisely behind his left ear. The devastating kinetic energy punched cleanly through the thin temporal bone, entering the cranial cavity and thoroughly destroying the brainstem. The catastrophic biological damage terminated all central nervous system functions in an absolute fraction of a second. Stoudenmire's right revolver discharged harmlessly into the dirt as his finger spasmed against the trigger. His imposing frame went entirely rigid, the kinetic shockwave traveling down his spine. He did not cry out or attempt to reach for the fatal head wound. Collapsing instantly, he folded heavily onto the sun-baked earth. His body struck the ground with a dull, echoing thud, kicking up a final small cloud of fine alkaline powder. The twin sidearms, the instruments dictating the harsh reality of the border town for over a year, slipped from his lifeless hands into the dirt. A profound ringing silence descended upon the commercial avenue, broken only by the sharp, ragged breathing of the wounded Doc rolling in the dust. Jim stood on the elevated wooden boardwalk, the smoking revolver lowered to his side, staring down at the motionless, bleeding corpse of the most terrifying adversary his criminal syndicate had ever faced. The giant was finally dead, The deeply embedded shrapnel, the ruined liver, and the crippling paranoia all extinguished simultaneously by a single perfectly placed projectile. Crimson fluid pooled rapidly beneath the shattered skull, staining the dry, colorless earth. The hot desert wind began to slowly blow away the lingering clouds of sulfuric black powder smoke, revealing the absolute finality of the brutal encounter. The siblings had successfully executed their desperate, highly dangerous trap. They had permanently removed the rogue federal agent from their territory, reclaiming their absolute dominance over the lucrative, unregulated vice trades of the expanding railroad hub. Hearing the definitive cessation of gunfire, the local civilian population slowly began opening their stout wooden shutters. Peering cautiously into the bright sunlit street, their eyes widened in shock as they surveyed the aftermath. The sight of the towering, seemingly invincible enforcer lying dead in the mud fundamentally altered their perception of the settlement's power dynamics. The brief, terrifying era of solitary, iron-fisted law enforcement had officially concluded in a pool of blood and shattered bone. Corrupt local deputies, having abandoned their posts during the height of the crisis, now slowly emerged from the transient camps. Approaching the scene with extreme caution, they remained deeply fearful that the massive corpse might suddenly rise. Confirming the complete lack of biological signs, they secured the perimeter. No attempt was made to arrest Jim. The syndicate leader handed his weapon to the authorities, citing clear, undeniable self-defense against a deranged, heavily intoxicated federal agent who had actively initiated the physical altercation. The municipal undertaker arrived with his familiar squeaking wooden cart, requiring the assistance of 4 strong laborers to lift the dense remains onto the flatbed. The stark reality of hoisting the man who had formerly commanded absolute terror throughout the avenue served as a grim testament to the unforgiving nature of the western frontier. The cartwheels dug deeply into the dirt, leaving a dark, morbid trail as they transported the fallen titan toward the designated preparation rooms. In the subsequent days, a formal, highly corrupt judicial inquest convened to examine the circumstances of the fatal shooting. The local grand jury, heavily influenced by syndicate bribes and deeply relieved by the removal of the unpredictable lawman, swiftly acquitted Jim of all criminal charges. The official legal ruling classified the homicide as a justifiable action taken to protect the life of his wounded sibling. The legal apparatus effectively stamped a seal of approval on the brutal street execution, solidifying the faction's return to power. Stoudenmire's body was washed, his ruined skull carefully wrapped in white bandages. Dressed in a clean, dark suit, entirely hiding the old Confederate shrapnel scars and the extensive physical decay caused by chronic alcoholism. Placed inside a stout timber casket, his calloused hands rested peacefully across his chest, forever separated from the cold steel grips of his custom firearms. The burial service was sparse, attended only by a few curious onlookers and the grave diggers tasked with sealing his remains beneath the hard Texas soil. The settlement of El Paso rapidly transitioned back to its highly profitable, chaotic baseline. Closed saloons reopened, their doors, the green faro tables filled with drunken transient laborers, and the illicit cribs resumed operations. The violent, uncompromising order imposed by the solitary lawman faded into a dark, whispered legend. The commercial avenues once again filled with the roar of freight wagons and the loud, unregulated commerce of a booming railroad hub, actively erasing the grim, silent terror that had previously defined the occupied town. Repairing the splintered doors of their gambling hall, the brothers wiped the spilled blood from the wooden floorboards. Resuming their lucrative extortion rackets and livestock smuggling operations, they remained completely unchallenged by the weak, easily corrupted municipal government. Mayor Schutz and the aldermen returned to their comfortable chambers, focusing solely on the rising economic profits while entirely ignoring the localized violence festering in the dark alleys. The political and criminal factions had successfully collaborated to eliminate the singular anomaly threatening their mutual survival. The unblinking pale eyes and the terrifying synchronized draw speed of Dallas Stoudenmire were buried deep within the alkaline dirt, permanently silenced. He arrived as a brutal instrument designed to tame a lawless frontier. But he ultimately turned the streets into a violent, deeply paranoid war zone. His final collapse in the dusty thoroughfare marked the definitive end of his tragic homicidal trajectory, leaving behind a bloody legacy deeply etched into the hardened mud and shattered adobe walls of the western borderlands.